Postmodernism begins when truth starts cracking. The story of postmodernism doesn't begin with a manifesto or a declaration. It begins with a crack, a fissure in the seemingly solid foundation of Western thought. Imagine standing in a grand cathedral of ideas, built over centuries by philosophers, scientists, and thinkers who believed they were constructing something eternal. Truth with a capital T, reason with a capital R, progress with a capital P. Then, sometime in the mid-20th century, the walls start to show fault lines, the ceiling creaks, and suddenly a group of thinkers looks up and says, what if this whole building is just one story among many? What if there's no single blueprint for reality? This is where postmodernism begins, not as a coherent philosophy, but as a mood, a suspicion, a growing unease with the grand narratives that had dominated Western civilization since the Enlightenment. To understand postmodernism, we must first understand what it reacts against, modernism, and before that, the entire project of modernity. The modern dream. Modernity was intoxicating. Beginning roughly in the 17th century with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, Western civilization embarked on an ambitious project to understand the world through reason, to liberate humanity from superstition and tradition, to harness nature through science, and to build a better future through progress. Philosophers like René Descartes believed we could find certain, indubitable truths through rational thought. I think, therefore I am. Scientists like Isaac Newton revealed that the universe operated according to mathematical laws. Political philosophers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau imagined societies built on rational principles of justice and liberty. This was the age of reason, and it promised everything. Knowledge would replace ignorance, science would replace superstition, democracy would replace tyranny, and prosperity would replace poverty. The modern worldview was fundamentally optimistic. History had a direction, forward. Human beings had an essence, rationality. Truth had a foundation, either in the external world for empiricists or in the structures of human reason. Reality was objectively knowable. Language transparently represented that reality, and progress was not just possible, but inevitable. Modernism in art and literature, roughly 1890 to 1940, represented both the culmination and the beginning of the crisis of this worldview. Modernist writers like James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and T.S. Eliot experimented with fractured narratives and stream of consciousness techniques that reflected the fragmentation of modern life. Modernist painters like Picasso shattered perspective and representation. Modernist composers like Schoenberg abandoned traditional harmony. Yet even in their experimentation, modernists still believed in the search for meaning, truth, and authentic expression. They were breaking old forms to find new, better ones. The crack widens, historical trauma. Then came the traumas of the 20th century, and the cracks in modernity's cathedral became chasms. World War I shattered the illusion of inevitable progress. The most advanced civilizations on Earth used their scientific and industrial prowess to slaughter millions in trenches. The Holocaust revealed that rationality and bureaucratic efficiency could be deployed for systematic genocide. The atomic bomb showed that scientific knowledge could threaten human existence itself. Colonial empires crumbled, revealing that the civilizing mission of the West had often been a cover for exploitation and violence. Meanwhile, within intellectual culture, various developments undermined the foundations of modern certainty. In physics, quantum mechanics and relativity theory showed that reality at fundamental levels didn't behave according to common sense or classical Newtonian principles. Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle suggested that at the quantum level, we couldn't simultaneously know both the position and momentum of a particle. Observation itself affected reality. In mathematics, Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems proved that any sufficiently complex formal system would contain true statements that couldn't be proven within that system. There were limits to logical certainty. In anthropology, figures like Claude Lévi-Strauss showed that primitive cultures had their own sophisticated logic and symbolic systems. Western rationality wasn't the only game in town. In philosophy, Ludwig Wittgenstein's later work suggested that meaning wasn't a matter of words corresponding to objects, but of language games embedded in forms of life. There was no view from nowhere, no neutral position outside all particular contexts. The postmodern sensibility emerges. By the 1960s and 70s, a new sensibility was crystallizing, particularly in France. A generation of thinkers, Jean-François Lyotard, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, Jean Baudrillard, began to systematically question the foundational assumptions of Western philosophy. They didn't just critique this or that theory, they interrogated the very concepts that modern thought took for granted: truth, reason, identity, reality, progress, human nature. What united these diverse thinkers, who often disagreed with each other and resisted the label postmodern, was a profound skepticism about grand narratives, universal truths, and stable meanings. They saw reality not as a fixed, objective given, but as constructed through language, power, and culture. They saw identity not as a stable essence, but as fluid, fragmented, and performed. They saw history not as linear progress, but as discontinuous, contingent, and shaped by power struggles. They saw language not as a transparent medium that represents reality, but as a system of signs that creates what we take to be reality. Postmodernism, then, begins with a loss of faith, not religious faith, but faith in the grand projects of modernity. Faith that reason alone could guide us to truth. Faith that science would solve all problems. Faith that history was progressing toward freedom and enlightenment. Faith that beneath all the surface differences there was a universal human nature. Faith that we could stand outside our particular perspective and see reality as it really is. This loss of faith wasn't necessarily nihilistic or defeatist. For many postmodern thinkers, it was liberating. If there's no single truth, then there's room for multiple truths, marginalized voices, alternative perspectives. If identity isn't fixed, then we're not imprisoned by categories of gender, race, or sexuality. If meaning isn't stable, then we can play with it, subvert it, create new meanings. If power is everywhere, then resistance is everywhere too. The core intuition. At its heart, postmodernism begins with a simple but radical intuition. What we take to be natural, universal, and necessary is actually historical, particular, and contingent. The categories we use to organize reality, subject-object, male-female, rational-irrational, civilized primitive, normal-abnormal, aren't discovered in nature but constructed through culture and language. The boundaries between fact and interpretation, reality and representation, nature and culture are blurrier than we thought. This doesn't mean reality doesn't exist, despite what critics claim. It means that our access to reality is always mediated by language, culture, and perspective. We can never step outside our human standpoint to see things from God's eye view. We're always already embedded in particular contexts, shaped by particular histories, speaking particular languages. There's no neutral, objective view from nowhere. Consider something as seemingly solid as human nature. Enlightenment thinkers took it for granted that humans had a universal essence, rationality for instance. But postmodernists ask, isn't what we call human nature shaped by history and culture? The very concept of the individual with inherent rights is a modern Western invention. Other cultures organize human life around community, honor, or duty rather than individual autonomy. What seems natural to us would seem strange to people in other times and places. Even our sense of having a unified, continuous self, what we call identity, might be a cultural construction rather than a metaphysical fact. Or consider science. Modernity saw science as the progressive discovery of objective truths about nature. But postmodernists, influenced by Thomas Kuhn's work on scientific revolutions, argue that science proceeds through paradigm shifts, fundamental changes in worldview rather than linear accumulation of facts. What counts as a valid question, a good explanation, or convincing evidence is shaped by the paradigm. Newtonian physics and quantum mechanics aren't just different theories, they're different ways of seeing reality. There's no standing outside all paradigms to judge which one corresponds to reality as it really is. The linguistic turn. A crucial development that enabled postmodernism was the linguistic turn in 20th century philosophy. The recognition that language isn't just a tool we use to describe a pre-existing reality, but actively shapes how we experience and understand reality. Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure argued that language is a system of differences. Words mean what they mean not because they correspond to things, but because they differ from other words in a system. The meaning of hot depends on its difference from cold, warm, lukewarm, etc. Signs are arbitrary. There's no natural connection between the sound tree and the actual plant. This insight had explosive implications. If meaning is generated through systems of difference rather than through correspondence to reality, then meaning is never fully present or stable. It's always relational, contextual, and shifting. Language doesn't reflect a pre-linguistic reality. It structures how we experience reality. Different languages don't just have different words for the same things, they carve up reality in different ways. This led postmodernists to focus intensely on language, discourse, texts, and signs. If our access to reality is always mediated by language, then analyzing how language works, how it creates meaning, how it includes and excludes, how it's bound up with power, becomes crucial. This is why postmodern philosophy often seems preoccupied with language rather than reality. It's not that postmodernists think only language exists. It's that they think we can't talk about reality without talking about the language we use to talk about reality. From Enlightenment to postmodernity. We can trace a rough trajectory. The Enlightenment believed in universal reason and objective truth accessible to any rational mind. Romanticism, early 19th century, emphasized feeling, imagination, and the particular over the universal, but still believed in authentic expression and meaningful depth. Modernism, late 19th to mid-20th century, responded to fragmentation and alienation by experimenting with form while still seeking truth and meaning. Postmodernism, mid-20th century onward, questions whether there's any truth to seek, any meaning to find, any foundation to build on. This progression isn't inevitable or linear, it's contested and messy. But there's a pattern, a gradual loss of confidence in foundations, universals, and grand narratives. Each stage inherits the problems of the previous one and radicalizes the critique. The double gesture. Here's what makes postmodernism slippery. It operates through what philosopher Richard Rorty called a double gesture. On one hand, it's deeply critical and deconstructive. It takes apart grand narratives, reveals hidden assumptions, shows how what seems natural is actually constructed. On the other hand, it's not proposing a new grand narrative to replace the old ones. That would be self-contradictory. Instead, it opens up space for play, difference, multiplicity, and contingency. This is why postmodernism frustrates people who want clear answers. It doesn't say the truth is X or we should do Y. It says, look at all the assumptions you're making. Look at what's excluded by your framework. Look at how power operates through your neutral concepts. Now that you see this, what will you do? It's more about destabilizing than establishing, more about questioning than answering. Why postmodern? The prefix post doesn't mean after in a simple chronological sense. We're not done with modernity, but rather critically coming to terms with. Postmodernity is both enabled by and critical of modernity. It uses the tools of modern critical reason to question the foundations of modern reason itself. It's parasitic on what it critiques. It needs modernity as the host it interrogates. This creates a paradox that runs through postmodernism. How can you critique reason without using reason? How can you argue against universal truth claims without making your own claim to truth? How can you deconstruct all foundations without standing somewhere? Critics see this as a fatal contradiction. Postmodernists see it as an unavoidable condition we must work within rather than overcome. The stakes. Why does this matter? Because these abstract philosophical debates have real-world consequences. How we think about truth affects everything from journalism to law to science. How we think about identity affects politics, ethics, and social movements. How we think about meaning affects art, culture, and communication. How we think about power affects how we organize society. Postmodernism arrived at a moment when the old certainties were crumbling anyway, when colonial empires were dissolving, when civil rights movements were challenging racial hierarchies, when feminism was questioning gender norms, when globalization was bringing different cultures into collision and exchange. Postmodern theory provided conceptual tools for these challenges. It helped people see that what the dominant culture presented as natural and inevitable, gender roles, racial categories, sexual norms, economic systems, were actually historical constructions that could be contested and changed. But it also created confusion and controversy. If there's no truth, just perspectives, then how do we adjudicate between competing claims? If everything is a social construction, what grounds do we have for critique? If all narratives are equally valid, how do we oppose injustice? These questions would plague postmodernism and fuel fierce debates that continue today. Origins of the chaos. Philosophers who started the fire. Postmodernism didn't emerge from nowhere. It has a genealogy, a lineage of thinkers who, like arsonists at a grand library, set fire to the comfortable certainties of Western philosophy. But these weren't mindless destroyers. They were careful, strategic incendiaries who targeted specific load-bearing assumptions holding up the edifice of modern thought. To understand postmodernism, we need to meet the philosophers who started the fire, who provided the matches, kindling, and intellectual accelerant that would eventually blaze into what we call postmodernity. Nietzsche, the madman with the hammer. If postmodernism has a patron saint, it's Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900. Writing in the late 19th century, decades before the term postmodern existed, Nietzsche launched an all-out assault on the foundations of Western philosophy and morality. His most famous proclamation, "God is dead," is often misunderstood. Nietzsche wasn't making an atheistic argument about whether God exists. He was diagnosing a cultural condition. The Enlightenment's critique of religion had worked too well, undermining not just belief in God, but the entire metaphysical framework that gave life meaning, truth, and value. For centuries, God had served as the ultimate foundation, the guarantor of truth, the source of moral values, the anchor of meaning. But once the scientific worldview displaced the religious one, what remained? Nietzsche saw that most of his contemporaries hadn't grasped the implications. They thought they could keep Christian morality without Christian metaphysics, keep universal values without a universal foundation. Nietzsche called this wishful thinking. His diagnosis was radical. Truth itself is a kind of fiction. What we call truth is just a particular perspective that has become dominant. There are no facts, only interpretations. Knowledge is a tool for domination, not a mirror of reality. Even logic and reason, the supposed foundations of philosophy, are just useful fictions, perspectives that have proven effective for human survival and flourishing. In works like Beyond Good and Evil and The Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche conducted what he called philosophy with a hammer, using genealogical critique to expose the hidden origins and questionable motives behind ideas we take as self-evident truths. For example, he traced Christian morality back to what he called resentment, the revenge of the weak against the strong, a revaluation of values that declared the powerful virtues of the ancient world, strength, pride, nobility, to be vices, and the weak virtues, humility, compassion, and meekness, to be moral goods. Nietzsche introduced several ideas that became central to postmodernism. Perspectivism. All knowledge is from a particular perspective. There's no view from nowhere. The will to power. The fundamental drive behind human behavior is not reason or self-preservation, but the desire to impose one's interpretation on the world. And eternal recurrence, the idea that life infinitely repeats, which serves as a test. Would you want to live your exact life over and over forever? Most importantly, Nietzsche challenged the very idea of stable, unified identity. The notion of a coherent, continuous self was for him a grammatical fiction, created by language. We say, "I think," because our language requires a subject for every verb. But there's no substantial I behind the thinking. There's just the thinking itself. The self is not a thing, but a process, a multiplicity, a constantly shifting drives and desires. Heidegger, Being and the Critique of Western Metaphysics. Martin Heidegger took up Nietzsche's critique and gave it an even more fundamental turn. His magnum opus, Being and Time, 1927, argued that Western philosophy since Plato had forgotten the most basic question: what does it mean for something to be? Instead of thinking about being itself, philosophy had focused on particular beings, objects, substances, essences. This forgetfulness of being led philosophy astray. Heidegger argued that we don't encounter the world primarily as detached observers contemplating objects. Instead, we're always already thrown into a world of meanings, purposes, and concerns. Before we can adopt a scientific, objective stance, we're embedded in a pre-theoretical understanding shaped by our culture, language, and history. The knowing subject that Descartes put at the center of philosophy, the I that thinks, is actually a derivative abstraction from our more basic mode of being in the world. This had huge implications. It meant that the supposedly neutral, objective, universal stance of modern science and philosophy was actually a particular, historically contingent way of relating to the world. One that treats everything as standing reserve, as resources to be calculated, manipulated, and exploited. Heidegger called this enframing, Gestell, and he saw it as the danger of technological modernity. When everything becomes mere resource, we forget other ways of encountering being, through poetry, art, wonder, and dwelling. Heidegger also emphasized the role of language in shaping our understanding. In his later work, he wrote that language is the house of being. We don't use language as a tool, we dwell within it. Language speaks through us as much as we speak it. Different languages open up different worlds, different ways of being. This anti-foundationalist emphasis on language, history, and interpretation deeply influenced postmodern thought. His critique of Western metaphysics, the tradition from Plato through Descartes to Hegel that sought ultimate foundations, whether in forms, in the thinking subject, or in absolute spirit, provided a template for postmodern deconstruction. If the entire tradition had been asking the wrong questions based on questionable assumptions, then we needed not just new answers, but a different way of thinking altogether. It's important to note that Heidegger's involvement with Nazism complicates his legacy. Postmodern thinkers often adopted his philosophical critiques while rejecting his politics, or debated whether the two could be separated. Saussure, the arbitrary sign. Ferdinand de Saussure, 1857–1913, wasn't a philosopher but a linguist, yet his course in general linguistics, published posthumously in 1916, revolutionized how we think about language and meaning, providing crucial tools for postmodern theory. Saussure's P insight was that language is a system of differences without positive terms. Traditional theories of meaning assumed that words refer to things. The word tree refers to actual trees in the world. But Saussure argued that the relation between signifier, the word, and signified, the concept, is arbitrary. There's no natural connection between the sound tree and the concept of tree. Other languages use different sounds for the same concept. Meaning arises not from words pointing to things, but from words differing from other words within a system. The meaning of hot depends on its difference from cold, warm, lukewarm, scalding, etc. Change any element in the system and the meanings of other elements shift. Meaning is relational and differential, not referential. Language doesn't reflect a pre-linguistic reality, it structures how we carve up and experience reality. This structuralist linguistics implied that there's no stepping outside language to check whether our words correspond to reality. We're always already inside systems of signs. Reality, as we experience and talk about it, is constructed through these systems. This insight that we can't access unmediated reality, only reality as represented through sign systems, became foundational for postmodernism. Saussure distinguished between langue, the abstract system of language, and parole, actual speech acts. He focused on the synchronic analysis of language as a system at a given moment rather than the diachronic study of how language changes over time. This emphasis on structure and system influenced the structuralist movement in anthropology, Claude Lévi-Strauss, psychoanalysis, Jacques Lacan, and later theory. Post-structuralists like Derrida would radicalize Saussure's insights while critiquing his residual assumptions. Wittgenstein, Language Games and Forms of Life. Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1891–1951, had two distinct philosophical careers, and both influenced postmodern thought in different ways. His early work, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, 1921, represented the culmination of logical positivism, the attempt to purify language and limit meaningful statements to those that could be verified empirically or proven logically. But his later work, especially Philosophical Investigations, 1953, represented a dramatic reversal that anticipated many postmodern themes. The later Wittgenstein argued that the search for the essence of meaning, or the perfect logical language, was misguided. Meaning isn't a matter of words corresponding to objects or thoughts. Meaning is use. To understand what a word means, look at how it's used in practice. Language consists of diverse language games, different activities with different rules embedded in different forms of life. The language game of giving orders is different from the game of making jokes, which is different from the game of doing science. There's no single universal logic of language. Different language games have different grammars, different criteria for what counts as meaningful or correct. Philosophical problems arise when we confuse one language game with another, when we try to use the grammar of one game in the context of another. Much traditional philosophy, Wittgenstein argued, consisted of such confusions. The solution wasn't better theories, but careful attention to how language actually works in practice. This had anti-foundationalist implications. There's no stepping outside all language games to find the real, true structure of language or reality. We're always already participating in particular forms of life, using particular tools for particular purposes. The idea of a universal, objective, context-independent rationality is a philosopher's fantasy. What counts as rational depends on the language game and form of life we're engaged in. Wittgenstein also emphasized the limits of language. Some things can be shown but not said. The most important aspects of life, ethics, aesthetics, the mystical, lie beyond the reach of factual, logical language. As he famously concluded the Tractatus, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." This wasn't a dismissal of these domains, but an acknowledgement that they exceed the limits of representational language. The later Wittgenstein influenced postmodernism's emphasis on language as practice rather than representation, its skepticism about universal foundations, and its attention to local contexts and particular forms of life. His methods of careful description rather than grand theorizing appealed to thinkers suspicious of philosophical system building. The Frankfurt School, Critique of Instrumental Reason. The Frankfurt School, a group of critical theorists associated with the Institute for Social Research, including Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and Herbert Marcuse, provided crucial critiques of instrumental reason and the culture industry that influenced postmodern thought, even as many postmodernists later broke with their Marxist framework. In Dialectic of Enlightenment, 1947, Adorno and Horkheimer argued that Enlightenment reason had dialectically reversed into its opposite. The project of rational mastery over nature had led to domination and control extending over human beings themselves. Instrumental reason, treating everything as mere means to ends, calculating efficiency rather than questioning ends themselves, had colonized all domains of life. The concentration camps represented not an aberration, but the terrible fulfillment of Enlightenment logic pushed to its extreme. The culture industry, mass entertainment, advertising, consumer capitalism produced standardized, commodified culture that manipulated people while giving them the illusion of choice and freedom. Genuine art, which might offer critical distance from society, was absorbed and neutralized. Even leisure became administered, programmed, and controlled. This critique resonated with postmodern concerns about how power operates through seemingly neutral institutions and how capitalism commodifies everything. But where the Frankfurt School maintained hope for genuine reason and authentic culture, if only we could recover it, postmodernists were more skeptical about these appeals to authenticity and less optimistic about any transcendent critical standpoint. Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, 1964, argued that advanced industrial society had created a totalizing system that absorbed all opposition, turning even rebellion into a commodity. This analysis of how systems incorporate and neutralize resistance influenced Foucault's later work on power and Baudrillard's analysis of simulation. Paradigm shifts and scientific revolutions. Thomas Kuhn, 1922 to 1996, was a historian of science whose The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, 1962, challenged the idea that science progresses through linear accumulation of objective facts. Instead, Kuhn argued, science operates within paradigms, comprehensive frameworks that define what questions are worth asking, what methods are valid, what counts as evidence, and what would constitute an answer. Normal science consists of puzzle solving within a paradigm. Scientists don't question the fundamental assumptions, they work within them. But occasionally, anomalies accumulate, phenomena the paradigm can't explain. Eventually, a crisis occurs, and a scientific revolution replaces the old paradigm with a new one. The shift from Ptolemaic to Copernican astronomy, from Newtonian to Einsteinian physics, these weren't just changes in theory, but changes in worldview. Crucially, Kuhn argued that paradigms are incommensurable. You can't fully translate concepts from one to another because they carve up reality differently. Scientists working within different paradigms literally see different worlds. There's no neutral observation language, no paradigm-independent reality we can appeal to in order to judge which paradigm is objectively correct. This suggested that science wasn't the progressive discovery of objective truth, but a succession of paradigms, each internally coherent, but not necessarily getting closer to reality as it really is. While Kuhn himself resisted the radical relativism some drew from his work, his analysis fueled postmodern skepticism about scientific objectivity and universal rationality. Structuralism, the system before the subject. Before post-structuralism and postmodernism, there was structuralism, a movement that sought to uncover the deep structures underlying human culture. Claude Lévi-Strauss applied Saussure's linguistics to anthropology, arguing that myths, kinship systems, and cultural practices across diverse societies were variations on underlying structures of human thought. Roland Barthes analyzed cultural myths and sign systems. Jacques Lacan reinterpreted Freudian psychoanalysis through linguistics, arguing that the unconscious is structured like a language. Structuralism was important for two reasons. First, it displaced the autonomous subject. Instead of focusing on individual intentions and consciousness, structuralism looked at the impersonal systems that shaped thought and behavior. The subject didn't master language, language spoke through the subject. Second, structuralism showed that what seems natural and inevitable, gender roles, cultural practices, even our sense of self, is actually structured by arbitrary cultural codes. However, structuralism maintained several features post-structuralists would challenge: faith in scientific method, belief in discoverable deep structures, emphasis on binary oppositions, and a relatively stable concept of the sign. The post-structuralists, Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze, emerged from within structuralism but radicalized its insights while rejecting its scientific pretensions and stable structures. The fire spreads. These thinkers, Nietzsche with his hammer, Heidegger with his destruction of metaphysics, Saussure with his arbitrary sign, Wittgenstein with his language games, the Frankfurt School with their critique of instrumental reason, Kuhn with his paradigm shifts, and the structuralists with their impersonal systems, provided the intellectual fuel for postmodernism. They didn't agree with each other on much. Some were German, some French, some Swiss, some American. Some were philosophers, some linguists, some historians. Some wrote before postmodernism existed, some during its emergence, but they shared a family resemblance: skepticism about foundations, attention to language and systems, critique of the autonomous subject, sensitivity to how power operates through seemingly neutral categories, and recognition that what seems universal is often particular. They showed that the comfortable certainties of modern thought rested on questionable assumptions. They provided conceptual tools for taking apart those assumptions. They started the fire. The specifically postmodern philosophers, Lyotard, Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze, and Baudrillard, would take these tools and push them further in more radical and unsettling directions. But they couldn't have done so without inheriting this legacy of critique. The chaos of postmodernism has origins in these careful, deliberate acts of intellectual arson, these strategic attacks on the load-bearing structures of Western thought. The question that remained was, once the fire burns through the old edifice, what emerges from the ashes? Lyotard's Bombshell, The Death of Big Stories. In 1979, a French philosopher named Jean-François Lyotard published a slim book called The Postmodern Condition, A Report on Knowledge. It was commissioned as a report on the state of knowledge in the most advanced societies. What Lyotard delivered was something far more explosive: a diagnosis of modernity's death and a definition of postmodernity that would become canonical. At its core was one simple, devastating claim: the grand narratives are dead. What are grand narratives? Lyotard's concept of grand narratives, sometimes translated as meta-narratives, refers to the big, overarching stories that modern culture told itself to justify and legitimate its practices, institutions, and knowledge claims. These weren't just any stories. They were comprehensive explanations of human history, its meaning, direction, and purpose. They promised to make sense of everything. The Enlightenment grand narrative went something like this: history is the progressive emancipation of humanity through reason and knowledge. Science will unlock nature's secrets, replacing superstition with truth. Rational social organization will replace tyranny and tradition with freedom and justice. Education will liberate people from ignorance. Technology will create prosperity. The human race is moving forward from darkness toward light, from bondage toward freedom, from ignorance toward knowledge. The Marxist grand narrative told a different story. History is the story of class struggle. Capitalism creates the conditions for its own transcendence. The contradictions of capitalism will lead to proletarian revolution, then to socialism, and eventually to communism, a classless society where humans are finally free from alienation and exploitation. History has a direction toward communism and a motor, class struggle. The liberal grand narrative of progress claimed: free markets and democratic institutions allowed to develop naturally will create increasing prosperity, freedom, and human flourishing. The invisible hand of the market coordinates individual self-interest for the collective good. Democracy expands through history, bringing liberty to more people. Science and technology steadily improve the human condition. The Christian grand narrative, which preceded but influenced modern narratives, history moves from creation through the fall to redemption and eventual salvation or damnation. Human life has meaning as part of God's plan. Suffering and injustice are temporary and will be resolved in the end times. Everything happens for a divine reason. What grand narratives do? These narratives served crucial functions. They legitimated institutions and practices. Universities produce knowledge as part of humanity's enlightenment. Capitalism is justified because it leads to progress. Science is valuable because it contributes to human emancipation. They gave meaning to individual lives. Your work contributes to human progress. Your suffering isn't meaningless, but part of a larger story moving toward resolution. They provided criteria for judging claims and actions. Does this advance human freedom? Does it contribute to the proletarian revolution? Does it glorify God? Grand narratives created what Lyotard called meta-discourse, a discourse that stands above other discourses to judge and legitimate them. Philosophy, especially Hegelian philosophy, claimed this meta-discursive position. It could survey all of history and knowledge from above, seeing the pattern, the meaning, the direction. Science claimed it too. The scientific method stands above particular scientific claims, legitimating them or rejecting them. Better performing parts in this series. Dims who used to be hallmarks. The death of grand narratives. Lyotard's Bombshell was to claim that in postmodern conditions, these grand narratives have lost their credibility. People, at least in advanced technologically developed societies, no longer believe in them. This isn't because a philosopher argued against them, though Nietzsche's God is Dead was a precursor, but because historical and social developments eroded their plausibility. Why did they die? Several reasons. First, historical catastrophes undermined progress narratives. How could we believe in inevitable human progress after Auschwitz, after the atomic bomb, after colonial genocide? The most enlightened societies produce the most efficient means of mass murder. Technology gave us not just prosperity, but the capacity for total destruction. Reason gave us not just liberation, but bureaucratic domination and instrumental control. Second, the narratives contradicted each other, and none could definitively establish its superiority. The Enlightenment narrative and the Marxist narrative offered conflicting accounts of history and liberation. Both couldn't be true, but neither could prove its superiority to the other using neutral criteria, because what counted as valid criteria was precisely what was in dispute. Each narrative legitimated itself through its own standards. Third, developments within knowledge itself undermine the idea of universal, comprehensive explanation. Quantum mechanics and relativity theory in physics, Gödel's incompleteness theorems in mathematics, chaos theory and complexity science all suggested that reality at fundamental levels resists comprehensive deterministic explanation. Knowledge became increasingly specialized, fragmented, and technical. No one could master all domains or show how they fit into a comprehensive whole. Fourth, the globalization of communication and culture exposed the parochialism of Western narratives. What seemed universal, the Enlightenment, progress, reason, turned out to be particular, European, modern, specific. Other cultures had their own narratives, and there was no neutral standpoint from which to judge them. The grand narratives weren't accounts of human history, they were Western ideology parading as universal truth. Fifth, the commodification and bureaucratization of knowledge changed its nature. Knowledge was no longer primarily about truth or emancipation, but about efficiency and performativity. The relevant question wasn't, is it true or does it advance human freedom, but does it work? Does it increase efficiency? Can we sell it? Knowledge became one more commodity in the capitalist system, its value measured by market criteria rather than reference to grand narratives. Postmodernity defined. This death of grand narratives is, for Lyotard, what defines postmodernity. Simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodern as incredulity toward meta-narratives. We no longer believe in overarching stories that give meaning and direction to history. We're skeptical of comprehensive explanations that claim to make sense of everything. We're suspicious of any discourse that claims to stand above all other discourses with universal criteria for truth and justice. This isn't nihilism, Lyotard insisted. It's not that nothing is true or valuable. It's that truth and value are plural, local, and contextual rather than singular, universal, and absolute. Instead of one grand narrative, we have many little narratives, local, limited, pragmatic stories that work within particular contexts without claiming universal validity. Science, for instance, doesn't discover the one true structure of reality and thereby contribute to human emancipation, the Enlightenment story. Instead, different scientific practices, particle physics, evolutionary biology, neuroscience, operate according to their own local criteria within their own specialized languages. They produce useful knowledge without adding up to a comprehensive picture of reality. They're language games, to use Wittgenstein's term, that work within particular forms of life. Language games and agonistics. Following Wittgenstein, Lyotard emphasized that language consists of diverse language games with different rules. There's no common measure between them, no universal meta-language in which to translate all games. The language game of science, seeking verifiable truth, is incommensurable with the language game of ethics, seeking justice, which is incommensurable with the language game of aesthetics, seeking beauty or sublimity. This creates an agonistic situation, a condition of conflict without resolution. Different language games make incommensurable claims. We can't appeal to a grand narrative or meta-discourse to adjudicate between them because such narratives have lost credibility. We're left with irreducible plurality, conflict, and negotiation. But Lyotard saw this as potentially liberating. Grand narratives were always totalizing. They subsumed differences under unifying explanations. They silenced voices that didn't fit the narrative. The Enlightenment narrative marginalized non-Western cultures as primitive or backward. The Marxist narrative reduced all struggles to class struggle, sidelining gender, race, and sexuality. Liberal progress narratives ignored those left behind by capitalism. Without grand narratives, there's space for multiplicity, for marginalized voices, for differences that don't fit into comprehensive schemes. We can recognize multiple, incompatible ways of speaking and living without needing to rank them in a hierarchy or subsume them under a single story. The performativity criterion. Yet Lyotard worried about what replaces grand narratives. In the postmodern condition, knowledge is increasingly judged by the criterion of performativity. Does it work? Does it increase efficiency, productivity, or power? This criterion comes from systems theory and cybernetics. Knowledge is good if it optimizes the performance of systems. The problem is that performativity reduces knowledge to instrumentality. Knowledge becomes purely means without consideration of ends. We don't ask whether genetic engineering or artificial intelligence should be developed, whether they're good for human flourishing or justice. We just ask, can we do it? Does it work? Is it efficient? This leads to what Lyotard called terror, the use of performativity to eliminate other criteria. If a practice or form of knowledge doesn't contribute to efficiency, it's defunded, marginalized, or eliminated. Humanities departments get cut because they don't produce measurable outputs. Basic research gets defunded in favor of applied research with immediate commercial applications. Knowledge that doesn't pay is considered worthless. Lyotard worried that without grand narratives to legitimate knowledge in terms of truth or emancipation, the performativity criterion would dominate completely. Capitalism and bureaucracy, which operate according to performativity, would colonize all domains. This would be a new form of totalitarianism, not ideological but technical, not overtly repressive but quietly eliminating alternatives. Legitimation crisis. The postmodern condition thus involves a legitimation crisis. The old grand narratives no longer legitimate institutions, practices, and knowledge claims. But nothing has replaced them except the performativity criterion, which is inadequate because it's purely instrumental. How do we legitimate universities, art, basic research, ethical claims, or political institutions? Lyotard didn't offer a solution so much as a diagnosis. He suggested that the death of grand narratives opened space for paralogy, the search for dissensus, instabilities, and paradoxes rather than consensus. Instead of seeking the one true theory that explains everything, we should celebrate and explore the proliferation of incommensurable language games. Instead of trying to resolve conflicts through appeal to universal principles, we should recognize that agonistic difference is the human condition. This stance is difficult to maintain. It seems to undercut the grounds for critique and political action. If all language games are incommensurable and no meta-discourse can judge between them, on what basis do we oppose injustice? Lyotard's response was that justice itself isn't something that can be grounded in a grand narrative. Justice consists in bearing witness to incommensurability, in respecting difference, in resisting the totalizing impulse to reduce everything to one system. Beyond the postmodern condition. Lyotard's later work moved in somewhat different directions, exploring the sublime in art and developing an ethics based on the radical otherness of the other. But the postmodern condition remains his most influential work, providing the most widely cited definition of postmodernity. Critics argued that Lyotard performatively contradicted himself. He told a grand narrative about the death of grand narratives. He claimed universal truth for the claim that universal truth is dead. He used meta-discourse to deny the possibility of meta-discourse. Lyotard acknowledged the paradox, but suggested it was unavoidable. We're inevitably entangled in what we critique. Others argued that Lyotard's emphasis on incommensurability and paralogy was politically defeatist. Without shared criteria or common ground, how do we build coalitions, argue for justice, or resist domination? Lyotard's response was that justice itself isn't something that can be grounded in a grand narrative. Justice consists in bearing witness to incommensurability, in respecting difference, in resisting the totalizing impulse to reduce everything to one system. Jürgen Habermas, a leading critic, argued that we need not grand narratives but shared communicative rationality, the ability to give reasons and seek understanding across differences. Yet Lyotard's diagnosis captured something real about the contemporary condition. In pluralistic, globalized, technologically advanced societies, the old certainties have indeed eroded. We don't collectively believe in inevitable progress, or the redemptive power of revolution, or the saving grace of God. We're suspicious of anyone who claims to have the one true story that explains everything. We recognize that knowledge is plural, contested, and bound up with power. Whether this is cause for celebration or alarm remains contested, but Lyotard's bombshell, that the grand narratives are dead and we're living in the ruins, permanently changed how we think about knowledge, legitimation, and modernity itself. The question became, what do we do in a world without big stories to give meaning and direction? How do we live after the death of grand narratives? The rest of postmodern thought can be read as diverse attempts to answer that question. Derrida's game, how meaning gets pulled apart. If Lyotard dropped a bombshell on grand narratives, Jacques Derrida planted explosives under meaning itself. Derrida, 1930-2004, was a French philosopher whose method of deconstruction became synonymous with postmodern textual analysis and sparked some of the fiercest controversies in late 20th century thought. His work is notoriously difficult, dense, playful, paradoxical, self-undermining. Reading Derrida often feels like watching someone pull apart the very language they're using to communicate. That's exactly the point. The target, logocentrism, and the metaphysics of presence. Derrida's critique targeted what he called logocentrism, the assumption that runs through Western philosophy from Plato to the present, that meaning is fully present in consciousness or speech, and that language is a transparent tool for expressing or communicating that meaning. The related concept is the metaphysics of presence, the idea that truth, meaning, consciousness, identity, and being are characterized by full, immediate presence. According to this tradition, when I speak, I know immediately what I mean. My meaning is fully present to my consciousness. The words I speak express that meaning. When you hear me, you grasp the meaning I intended. Meaning is present, determinate, and stable. Writing is merely a secondary, derivative tool for recording speech. Speech is closer to meaning because when I speak, my consciousness is immediately present to itself and to you. This assumption shapes how philosophy has thought about truth, correspondence between thought and reality, identity, self-presence of consciousness to itself, and meaning, intention of the speaker. It privileges presence over absence, speech over writing, origin over derivation, unity over difference, inside over outside. Derrida's lifelong project was to show that this entire framework is incoherent. The metaphysics of presence doesn't describe how meaning, language, or consciousness actually work. It's a fantasy that philosophy has clung to despite its impossibility. And revealing its impossibility doesn't lead to nihilism, but to a richer, more complex understanding of meaning, identity, and textuality. Différance, the engine of meaning. Derrida's most important concept is différence, spelled with an A in French instead of the usual E. The neologism combines two French words, différer, to differ, and différer, to defer. The two meanings are crucial. Meaning operates through difference, Saussure's insight, and through deferral, Derrida's addition. Following Saussure, meaning arises through difference. Hot means what it means because it differs from cold, warm, etc. But Derrida radicalized this. If meaning comes from difference, then no element in the system has inherent positive meaning. Every element is defined by its relations to other elements. To understand what hot means, you need to understand cold. But to understand cold, you need to understand hot, warm, lukewarm, freezing, etc. Meaning is always relational, always involving reference to other elements. This means meaning is never fully present. When I use the word hot, its meaning isn't simply present in the word or in my consciousness. The meaning involves a trace of all the other words it differs from, which aren't present. Meaning is constituted by absence as much as present, by what's not there as much as what is. The second sense, deferral, adds a temporal dimension. To understand a word, you need to see how it functions in a sentence, which means you can't grasp it immediately. You have to wait for what comes after. Meaning is deferred, postponed, never fully present at any single moment. Even after you hear the whole sentence, you might need more context, the paragraph, the document, the broader discourse. Meaning is always to come, never fully arrived. Différance is neither a word nor a concept in the traditional sense. It's the condition that makes meaning possible, but can never itself be fully present. It's the movement of differing and deferring that generates meaning without ever resolving into a stable, present meaning. It's the play or spacing that disrupts the metaphysics of presence. Crucially, the difference between différance and différence is invisible in speech. They're pronounced the same in French. You can only see it in writing. This challenges the privileging of speech over writing. Writing isn't derivative. It reveals something essential about how meaning works, through marks, traces, differences, and absences, rather than through immediate presence. Deconstruction, not destruction. Derrida's method of reading texts, which he called deconstruction, isn't about destroying or dismissing them. It's a way of showing how texts undermine their own apparent claims, how they rely on assumptions they simultaneously question, how they contain within themselves resources for reading them against themselves. Deconstruction reveals that texts don't simply express an author's intended meaning. Instead, the textual machinery, the play of signifiers, the rhetorical figures, the binary oppositions, the marginal comments, the footnotes, produces meanings that exceed, complicate, or contradict the author's conscious intention. Texts don't have a single, stable, determinate meaning. They're open to multiple readings, and careful attention reveals instabilities and undecidabilities. A typical deconstructive reading identifies binary oppositions in a text: speech/writing, presence/absence, nature/culture, male/female, literal/metaphorical, and shows how the text privileges one term while subordinating the other. Then it demonstrates that the privileged term actually depends on the subordinated term. The opposition isn't stable but hierarchical and unstable. Finally, it explores how the text itself contains resources for inverting or displacing the opposition. For example, in Plato, writing is subordinated to speech because writing is a mere copy of speech, which is itself a copy of thought. Writing is twice removed from truth. But Derrida shows that Plato's own texts exhibit features he attributes negatively to writing: absence of the author, possibility of misinterpretation, dependence on context. Moreover, Plato uses metaphors of writing to describe memory and thought itself. The soul is like a wax tablet inscribed with impressions. So writing isn't simply external to thought, it's the condition of possibility for thought. The attempt to exclude writing as external and derivative fails. Writing is always already inside, contaminating the purity of speech and presence. Deconstruction isn't a method you apply mechanically. It's a way of attending carefully to how texts work, to their language and logic, revealing tensions and aporias, irresolvable puzzles within them. Every text contains the resources for its own deconstruction. The reader doesn't impose deconstruction from outside, but traces movements already happening within the text. Key deconstructive concepts. Trace. Every sign carries the trace of other signs, of what it differs from and defers to. Meaning is never self-contained, but always refers beyond itself to an indefinable network of other signs. The trace is the mark of otherness within presence. It shows that nothing is ever purely present to itself. Supplement. Derrida analyzed Rousseau's concept of the supplement, something that's supposed to be merely additional or external, like writing supplements speech, but turns out to be necessary. Speech needs writing to preserve and communicate across distance. The supplement both adds to and substitutes for what it supplements, revealing that the original wasn't complete or self-sufficient. Iterability. For a sign to function as a sign, it must be repeatable in different contexts. But this means its meaning can never be completely determined by any single context. Every use of a sign is both a repetition and an alteration. Signs must be iterable, but this very iterability introduces instability and difference. Aporious. Derrida was drawn to moments of undecidability, aporious, where texts reach impasses, where decisions must be made but can't be grounded in certain knowledge. Ethics, politics, and justice involve such moments. We must decide, but never with full certainty or complete grounds. This doesn't paralyze action, it characterizes the human condition. Writing and the text. Derrida's rehabilitation of writing was radical. He argued that what philosophy disparaged as writing, marks, traces, differences, spacing, absence, actually characterizes all language and even consciousness itself. Thought isn't self-present. It operates through differences, traces, and deferrals. Consciousness isn't transparent to itself. It's structured like a text. This led to the famous, infamous statement, "There is nothing outside the text," or "there is no outside text." This doesn't mean reality doesn't exist. It means we can't appeal to some unmediated reality or authorial intention outside textual systems to fix meaning. We're always already within networks of signs, discourses, texts. Our access to reality is always mediated by signifying systems. This made text-centrism central to postmodern thought. If we can't step outside textuality, then careful reading of texts, philosophical, literary, political, cultural, becomes a crucial critical practice. How texts construct meaning, identity, truth, and power becomes the central question. Implications and controversies. Derrida's work had explosive implications. If meaning is inherently unstable, if texts undermine themselves, if there's no determinate, fixed meaning, then what happens to truth, interpretation, communication, and rationality? Critics, especially analytical philosophers, accuse Derrida of relativism, nihilism, and obscurantism. They argued that deconstruction destroys the possibility of truth and rational discussion. If texts can mean anything, they mean nothing. If meaning is always deferred, we can never communicate successfully. If every argument can be deconstructed, intellectual inquiry becomes pointless. Derrida and his defenders responded that these criticisms misunderstand deconstruction. Deconstruction doesn't claim anything goes or that meaning is arbitrary. It reveals that meaning is more complex, unstable, and context-dependent than logocentrism assumes. Successful communication happens despite, or rather through, this instability. We negotiate meanings, adjust to contexts, and work with undecidability. That's how language actually functions. Deconstruction isn't against truth or reason. It questions a particular metaphysical picture of truth as correspondence to presence and reason as algorithmic logic. Different kinds of truth and rationality remain possible, contextual, pragmatic, open to revision. Politically, deconstruction seemed to some a retreat into textual play, apolitical and quietistic. Others saw it as radically political precisely because it undermined the claims to natural necessity and objective truth that legitimate power structures. If identities like gender, race, and nationality are textual constructions rather than natural facts, they can be contested and transformed. Derrida's later work engaged explicitly with ethical and political questions, justice, hospitality, forgiveness, democracy to come. He argued that justice is impossible but necessary. We must pursue it without ever achieving it, without final criteria that tell us definitively what justice is. This impossibility isn't a flaw, but the condition of possibility for ethics. If we already knew what justice was with certainty, ethical life would be reduced to calculation. Ethics happens in the undecidable space where we must respond to the other without guarantees. Derrida's legacy. Derrida's influence spread far beyond philosophy into literary studies, legal studies, architecture, theology, and cultural studies. Deconstruction became a dominant mode of reading in humanities departments, sometimes degenerating into formulaic moves. Find binary oppositions, invert them, but at its best encouraging careful, creative, critical reading. Critics remained fierce. Analytical philosophers largely rejected Derrida as obscure charlatanry. Scientists saw deconstruction as threatening the objectivity of scientific knowledge. This led to the science wars of the 1990s. Some on the left saw deconstruction as politically defeatist, undermining the grounds for emancipatory politics. But Derrida showed that meaning is a game, not frivolous, but playful in the sense of involving movement, instability, and creativity. Meaning gets pulled apart not as destruction, but as revelation of how it actually works, through difference, deferral, trace, and supplement. The metaphysics of presence was always a fantasy. Recognizing this doesn't end meaning, it opens up new possibilities for thinking, reading, and living with the inherent instability and openness of language. Whether you see this as liberation or catastrophe depends on whether you think we need foundations or can learn to live without them. Derrida bet on the latter, not as nihilism, but as affirmation of the infinite play of meaning, the irreducible otherness of the other, and the ongoing task of justice that can never be completed but must always be pursued.
Foucault Unmasked. Michel Foucault, 1926 to 1984, changed how we think about power, knowledge, and the human subject. If Derrida deconstructed texts, Foucault analyzed institutions, practices, and discourses. His genealogical method traced the hidden histories of things we take for granted: madness, sexuality, criminality, the self, revealing that what seems natural and inevitable is actually historically constructed through relations of power and knowledge. His most enduring insight: power is not just repressive, held by the state, prohibiting and punishing, but productive, creating subjects, generating knowledge, shaping desires. Power is everywhere, not because it dominates everything, but because it comes from everywhere. Early work: Madness and Reason. Foucault's first major work, Madness and Civilization, 1961, traced how madness was understood and treated from the Renaissance through the modern asylum. In the Middle Ages and Renaissance, mad people were part of the social fabric: fools, jesters, visionaries. But beginning in the 17th century, a great confinement occurred. Mad people, along with paupers, vagabonds, and the unemployed, were locked away in institutions. The Enlightenment and modern psychiatry claimed this represented progress, moving from superstition to scientific understanding, from neglect to treatment. Foucault challenged this progressive narrative. The asylum wasn't liberation, but a new form of control. The humane treatment pioneered by reformers like Philippe Pinel didn't free the mad. It created modern forms of normalization and self-surveillance. The asylum made subjects internalize social norms, judging themselves by standards of reason and productivity. This early work introduced themes that would run through Foucault's career: the problematization of progress narratives, the link between knowledge and power, the historical contingency of categories we take as natural: reason, madness, normal, abnormal, and the role of institutions in creating subjects. The archaeology of knowledge. In The Order of Things, 1966, and The Archaeology of Knowledge, 1969, Foucault developed his archaeological method for analyzing systems of thought. He wasn't interested in the history of ideas, how thinkers influenced each other, but in the underlying epistemes, the deep structures that determined what could be thought, said, and seen as true in a given period. In different epistemes, knowledge is organized according to different principles. In the Renaissance, knowledge was organized by resemblance and similitude. Things were understood through their correspondences. In the Classical Age, 17th-18th century, knowledge was organized by representation and classification, creating taxonomies and tables to order reality. In the Modern Age, 19th century onward, knowledge became organized by deep, hidden structures: life, labor, language, that had to be uncovered by sciences like biology, economics, and linguistics. Foucault argued that man, the human subject, as both knowing and known, both subject and object of knowledge, was an invention of the modern episteme. The Renaissance didn't have our concept of human nature or the individual subject. Modernity created the figure of man at the center of knowledge, but this figure is historically contingent. Foucault famously concluded The Order of Things with the prediction that man is a recent invention and would soon be erased, like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea. This was anti-humanist, in the sense that it challenged the idea that there's a stable, ahistorical human essence or subject. What we take to be human nature is produced by particular historical configurations of knowledge and power. Discipline and Punish: The Birth of Modern Power. Foucault's most influential work, Discipline and Punish, 1975, analyzed the transformation of punishment from the spectacular violence of public execution to the disciplinary techniques of the modern prison. In the Classical Age, punishment was a public spectacle: torture, execution, dismemberment of the body. But by the 19th century, punishment became hidden in prisons, focused on reforming the soul through discipline. This shift, Foucault argued, reflected a broader transformation in how power operates. Modern power doesn't primarily work through spectacular violence and repression, those remain. It works through discipline, normalization, and surveillance. It creates docile, productive bodies through training, examination, and hierarchy. Foucault famously analyzed Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, a prison design where a central tower allows a guard to observe all prisoners without them knowing whether they're being watched. The genius of the panopticon is that prisoners internalize surveillance. They discipline themselves, assuming they might be watched. Power becomes self-enforcing. The panopticon became Foucault's metaphor for modern disciplinary society. Schools, hospitals, factories, barracks all use similar techniques: hierarchical observation, normalizing judgment, and examination. They don't just repress, they produce particular kinds of subjects: students, patients, workers, soldiers. They create norms and then measure, classify, and correct individuals according to those norms. This is power as productive rather than merely repressive. It doesn't just say no or prohibit. It creates knowledge through examination and documentation, shapes bodies through training and drill, and forms subjects, teaching people to be certain kinds of individuals: punctual, obedient, efficient, self-monitoring. Power/knowledge. For Foucault, power and knowledge are inextricably linked. Power/knowledge, pouvoir, savoir. Knowledge isn't neutral, it's produced within relations of power. And power operates through knowledge, through classifications, examinations, expertise, and discourses. Consider psychiatry. It claims to be objective knowledge about mental illness. But Foucault showed that psychiatric knowledge emerged alongside institutions, the asylum, and practices, examination, diagnosis, treatment, that exercised power over the mad. Psychiatric knowledge defines normality and abnormality, creating categories of subjects: neurotics, psychotics, perverts, and legitimating interventions: confinement, therapy, medication. Knowledge about madness is inseparable from power over the mad. Or consider criminology. It claims to objectively study crime and criminals. But criminology emerged with the prison system and practices of surveillance and examination. It creates the concept of the criminal as a type of person, dangerous, abnormal, requiring correction, rather than just someone who commits illegal acts. This knowledge legitimates the power of the criminal justice system. This doesn't mean knowledge is just ideology or false consciousness. It's not that power distorts truth. Rather, truth itself is produced within regimes of power. Truth is a thing of this world, Foucault wrote. Each society has its regime of truth, the types of discourse it accepts as true, the mechanisms for distinguishing truth from false, the techniques for obtaining truth, the status of those who say what counts as true. This challenges the Enlightenment idea that knowledge liberates by revealing truth. Knowledge can also constrain, categorize, normalize, and control. Human sciences like psychology, sociology, criminology, and sexology created new ways of knowing subjects, but also new ways of governing them. Genealogy and history. In the 1970s, influenced by Nietzsche, Foucault developed genealogy, a way of writing history that traces the contingent emergence of practices rather than assuming linear progress or rational development. Genealogy uncovers the messy, discontinuous, power-laden history behind things that seem natural and necessary. The genealogical method involves 3 refusals. 1. Refusing the search for origins. There's no original, pure moment before power or history. 2. Refusing teleology. History doesn't have a direction or purpose toward which it's moving. 3. Refusing the assumption that present arrangements are the outcome of rational progress. They're the outcome of struggles, accidents, and power relations. Genealogy asks, how did this particular practice or institution emerge? What power struggles, conflicts, and contingencies shaped it? What alternatives existed? Genealogy denaturalizes what seems obvious, showing its historical emergence. The history of sexuality. Foucault's unfinished History of Sexuality project applied genealogy. The conventional story holds that Victorianism repressed sexuality, surrounding it with silence and prohibition, and that the sexual revolution of the 20th century liberated us from repression. Foucault challenged this repressive hypothesis. In Volume 1, 1976, he argued that modernity didn't repress sexuality, but incited endless discourse about it. Beginning in the 17th century, confession extended from religious practice to secular domains. People were required to confess their sexual thoughts, desires, and acts to doctors, psychiatrists, educators. Sexuality became an object of intense scientific study. Sexology emerged to classify and explain sexual behaviors and identities. This will to knowledge about sexuality wasn't liberation, but a new form of power, biopower. Modern power doesn't just govern through law and sovereignty, forbidding and punishing. It governs life itself, managing populations, regulating health, sexuality, and reproduction. Biopower operates through norms rather than laws, through expertise rather than command, through life rather than death. Sexuality became central to biopower. By classifying sexual behaviors, heterosexual, homosexual, normal, perverse, expertise created identities and categories of persons. The homosexual, as a type of person, Foucault argued, was invented in the 19th century. Before, there were same-sex acts, but not homosexual identity. Once sexuality defined identity, people related to themselves as sexual subjects, governed by norms of healthy and pathological sexuality. The production of sexual discourse, identities, and norms wasn't simple repression. It was the creation of sexuality as we know it. Foucault's provocative conclusion, the repressive hypothesis, was itself part of the discursive production of sexuality. By framing sexuality as repressed, modernity intensified attention to it, making it the hidden truth of the self that must be discovered and liberated. Later volumes examined ancient Greek and Roman practices of the self, exploring how individuals worked on themselves to become ethical subjects. This wasn't about internalizing norms imposed from outside, but practices of the self, techniques individuals used to shape their own existence. This opened up possibilities for resistance and self-fashioning that the earlier emphasis on disciplinary power seemed to foreclose. Power everywhere. Foucault's most radical claim, power is not something held by a ruling class or concentrated in the state. Power is relational, exercised rather than possessed. It operates through networks, practices, and institutions at every level of society, in families, schools, clinics, not just in government or law. Power comes from below as well as above. It's not simply imposed on passive subjects, but produced through their participation. When students internalize discipline, when patients confess to doctors, when workers monitor themselves, power operates through their actions, not just on them. Moreover, where there's power, there's resistance. Resistance isn't outside power, waiting to be liberated. It's internal to power relations, emerging from the same networks and practices. Resistance can be co-opted, but new resistances continually emerge. Power isn't totalizing. It's unstable, contested, and productive of resistance as well as domination. This transformed how we think about politics. Instead of focusing only on state power, sovereignty, and law, we should analyze microphysics of power, the local, everyday practices and techniques through which power operates. Political struggle happens not just in revolutions or legislation, but in schools, clinics, families, cultural practices. Critique and legacy. Foucault's work sparked enormous controversy. Critics accused him of determinism. If power is everywhere, how is resistance possible? If subjects are produced by power, who resists? Relativism. If truth is historically produced within regimes of power, is all truth relative? Can we critique power without appealing to independent truth? Amoralism. Foucault's genealogies describe power relations without clear normative judgments. What's wrong with disciplinary power if we can't appeal to human nature or freedom? Totalization. Despite emphasizing resistance, Foucault's account of disciplinary society seems totalizing. Power is everywhere, surveillance is panoptic, subjects are produced by discourse. Foucault resisted these charges. He insisted resistance is always possible because power is relational and unstable. His genealogies aim to destabilize present arrangements, showing their contingency and thereby opening possibilities for transformation. He didn't offer a positive political program because he thought intellectuals shouldn't prescribe. They should problematize, raising questions rather than providing answers. Yet tensions remain. If power produces subjects, how do subjects achieve critical distance from power? If there's no outside-to-power relations, what grounds critique? Foucault's late turn to practices of the self and ethics suggested one response. Even within relations of power, subjects can work on themselves, create new forms of subjectivity, and experiment with different ways of living. Foucault's legacy is immense. His concepts, biopower, governmentality, discourse, discipline, normalization, became central to postmodern analysis. His genealogical method influenced historians, sociologists, and cultural theorists. His insistence that power is productive, not just repressive, and that knowledge is bound up with power, transformed political thought. His work enabled queer theory, critical race studies, and disability studies by showing how categories and identities are constructed through power/knowledge. Foucault unmasked power's operations in the most ordinary and taken-for-granted practices. He showed that power isn't just something external that oppresses us, but something internal that shapes who we are, and that this realization doesn't trap us, but enables new forms of critique and resistance. Power is everywhere, not as totalitarian domination, but as the unstable, contested field within which we live, think, and struggle.
Deleuze's wild world, difference, rhizomes, and infinite repetition. Gilles Deleuze, 1925–1995, was the most exuberant and experimental of the postmodern philosophers, creating concepts that seemed designed to explode conventional thinking. Rhizomes, bodies without organs, desiring machines, assemblages, deterritorialization. His philosophy is difficult and strange, blending influences from Spinoza, Nietzsche, and Bergson with contemporary science, literature, and cinema. Where Derrida deconstructed and Foucault genealogized, Deleuze constructed, building wild conceptual machines to think difference, multiplicity, and becoming. Against representation, difference in itself. Deleuze's major philosophical work, Difference and Repetition, 1968, mounted a sustained attack on the Western philosophical tradition's subordination of difference to identity. Since Plato, philosophy has understood difference in terms of identity. A differs from B because A is identical to itself, A equals A, and B is identical to itself, B equals B, and A is not B. Difference is external, between things. Identity is primary, difference is secondary and derivative. Deleuze reversed this. Difference is primary, identity is derivative. Things don't differ because they have different identities. Rather, identity emerges from more fundamental processes of differentiation. Think of biological development. A fertilized egg differentiates into diverse tissues and organs. The differentiation is primary. The distinct identities of heart, lung, brain emerge from differentiation. Or think of language. Meaning emerges through differentiation, Saussure's point. The identity of a sign comes from its difference from other signs. Difference isn't a relation between pre-existing identities, it's the process that generates identities in the first place. Deleuze called this difference in itself. Difference not between things, but the internal genetic difference that produces things. It's not the difference we perceive between objects, but the differential processes, intensities, singularities, multiplicities that give rise to objects. This leads to a philosophy of becoming rather than being. Reality isn't made of stable substances with fixed identities. It's a continuous process of differentiation, transformation, and emergence. Things are temporary stabilizations of flows and intensities. Identity is a snapshot of an ongoing process of becoming. Repetition and eternal return. Repetition, the other major concept in his early work, is linked to difference. Deleuze distinguished three kinds of repetition. 1. Bare repetition, mechanical repetition of the same, clock ticking, factory production line. 2. Repetition clothed in difference. Each repetition differs slightly. Leaves on a tree are similar but not identical. 3. Repetition of difference itself. The eternal return of difference, not the return of the same, but the return of becoming, novelty, and difference. Deleuze reinterpreted Nietzsche's eternal return. The eternal return doesn't mean everything that has happened will happen again identically, mechanical repetition of the same. It means that difference, becoming, and transformation eternally return. What returns is not the identical, but the power of differing. This is affirmative philosophy, saying yes to life, to becoming, to difference. Instead of seeking stable truth or enduring identity, affirm the chaotic, creative, differential process of reality. Instead of resenting time and change, wanting things to stay the same or reach a final end, affirm time as creative becoming. The rhizome, non-hierarchical multiplicity. In 1000 Plateaus, 1980, written with Felix Guattari, Deleuze introduced one of his most influential concepts. A rhizome is a botanical term for plants like grass or ginger that spread through underground root systems, sprouting new shoots anywhere. Unlike trees, which have hierarchical structure, trunk, branches, and leaves, rhizomes are non-hierarchical networks. Deleuze and Guattari used the rhizome as a model for non-hierarchical thought and organization. Western thought has been arborescent, tree-like, hierarchical, seeking foundations and origins. From foundational principles, consequences branch out hierarchically. Knowledge is organized hierarchically. Fundamental sciences like physics ground higher-level sciences. Rhizomatic thought resists hierarchy and foundations. It makes connections between any points, spreads horizontally rather than growing vertically, has no center or organizing principle. A rhizome can be broken and reconnect elsewhere. It's heterogeneous, made of diverse elements. It's n-dimensional, not reducible to unity or duality, but irreducibly multiple. Examples of rhizomes: the internet, no center, connections between any nodes. Mycelial networks, fungi connecting trees underground. Nomadic societies, decentralized, mobile, leaderless. Guerrilla resistance, no fixed position or command structure. Rhizomatic thinking is anti-essentialist. Instead of asking, what is X, seeking an essence or definition, ask, how does X function? What does it connect to? What does it do? Instead of taxonomies and categories, think in terms of assemblages and networks. Assemblages and territorialization. An assemblage, agissement, is a provisional collection of heterogeneous elements that functions together temporarily. A book is an assemblage: words, paper, binding, author, reader, historical context, other text it refers to. None of these elements has an essence independent of the assemblage. The assemblage creates provisional identity. Assemblages form through processes of territorialization, establishing boundaries, order, stability, and deterritorialization, breaking boundaries, creating chaos, opening to the outside. Nothing is permanently territorialized or deterritorialized. There's constant movement between stability and transformation. For example, language territorializes. It fixes meanings, establishes grammatical rules, creates standard dialects. But literature deterritorializes language. Poets and novelists invent new expressions, break rules, push language to its limits. Then education reterritorializes, teaching the canon, standardizing interpretation. Politics involves struggles over territorialization. States territorialize, establishing borders, laws, identities, bureaucratic order. Revolutionary movements deterritorialize, breaking down old orders, creating new possibilities. Then states reterritorialize, absorbing resistance, capturing revolutionary energy, reimposing control. Capitalism is a particularly powerful deterritorializing force, breaking down traditional social structures, commodifying everything, creating constant innovation and change. But it also reterritorializes property rights, contracts, corporate hierarchy, commodification itself as a new form of control. Deleuze and Guattari's political philosophy involves navigating between the dangers of rigid territorialization, fascism, paranoia, closure, and total deterritorialization, chaos, schizophrenia, dissolution. Politics requires both lines of flight, escaping capture, creating new possibilities, and organization, building durable structures. Desiring machines and anti-Oedipus. In Anti-Oedipus, 1972, Deleuze and Guattari launched a radical critique of psychoanalysis, particularly Freud's Oedipus complex. Freud claimed that unconscious desire is structured by the family drama, desire for mother, rivalry with father, castration anxiety. Psychoanalysis interprets all desire through this Oedipal narrative. Deleuze and Guattari argued this was a reactionary reduction of desire's revolutionary potential. Unconscious desire isn't structured by family triangles. It's machinic, productive, connective, multiplying. Desire isn't lack, wanting what you don't have, but production. Desire doesn't need objects external to itself. It produces reality, connections, intensities. They proposed schizoanalysis instead of psychoanalysis. Instead of interpreting desire through Oedipal narrative, reducing everything to mommy, daddy, me, schizoanalysis traces how desire connects, produces, and creates assemblages. Instead of resolving desire into a stable ego, schizoanalysis releases desire's revolutionary potential. This linked to their political critique of capitalism. Capitalism both liberates and captures desire. It breaks down traditional social codes, deterritorialization, unleashing desire's productive force. But it recaptures desire through commodification. Everything becomes a commodity to be consumed. Revolutionary politics requires liberating desire from both traditional codes and capitalist capture. Bodies without organs. Another provocative concept, the body without organs, BWO, borrowed from Antonin Artaud. The organism, the organized, hierarchical, functional body, is a stratification imposed on the body. Beneath biological organization lies the BWO, a plane of intensities, flows, and becomings not yet organized into organs and functions. The BWO isn't against organs, but against the organization that subordinates organs to a fixed structure. It's the body as potential rather than actuality, as intensive process rather than organized form. Creating a BWO means undoing rigid organizations to release new capacities and connections. Examples: the masochist creates a BWO by undoing the organization of pleasure and pain, the anorexic by undoing the organization of eating, the drug user by undoing the organization of perception. These aren't necessarily positive. Deleuze and Guattari warned against total deterritorialization leading to death or catatonia, but illustrate the principle, undoing rigid organization to experiment with new possibilities. This extends beyond individual bodies to social bodies. Societies have organizations, state, law, family, economy, that can become rigid stratifications. Revolutionary politics creates a social BWO, undoing rigid stratifications to enable new social formations. Becoming and multiplicity. Deleuze's philosophy is one of becoming rather than being. Nothing has a fixed, stable essence. Everything is in process, transforming, connecting with other things to create new assemblages. Becoming woman, becoming animal, becoming imperceptible, these aren't metaphors but literal processes of transformation. Becoming woman, for Deleuze and Guattari, problematically from feminist perspectives, doesn't mean becoming female. It means escaping the majoritarian standard, white, male, adult, rational, and moving toward minoritarian positions that don't fit the standard. Women, children, animals, the mad, minoritarian not because there are fewer of them, but because they're outside the norm that defines the standard human. Becoming animal involves not imitating animals, but entering into assemblages with animals that transform both. Becoming imperceptible is the limit of becoming, dissolving identity altogether into pure flows and intensities. These concepts challenged standard notions of identity, subjectivity, and essence. You don't have a fixed identity. You have multiple, partial, provisional identities formed through assemblages. You're not a unified subject, but a multiplicity, a collection of intensities, desires, and connections in constant transformation. Creativity and vitalism. Underlying Deleuze's philosophy is a kind of vitalism, a belief in life's creative power to invent new forms, to differ from itself, to become. Reality isn't mechanical repetition or entropic decay. It's creative evolution, following Bergson, constantly producing novelty. Philosophy's task for Deleuze is creating concepts. Concepts aren't representations of pre-existing reality. They're inventions, tools for thinking, ways of cutting into the chaos of experience to create sense. Philosophy creates concepts the way artists create artworks or scientists create theories, as experiments, interventions, provocations. Deleuze wrote books on painters, Francis Bacon, filmmakers, Godard, Wells, and novelists, Proust, Kafka, showing how their work creates new ways of seeing, thinking, and experiencing. Art isn't representation. It's the creation of percepts and affects, ways of perceiving and feeling that exceed personal experience, accessing impersonal intensities. Critique and controversies. Deleuze's philosophy has been criticized as obscure and jargon-laden. Critics complain that concepts like body without organs and desiring machines are incomprehensible or empty. Politically irresponsible. The celebration of deterritorialization, schizophrenia, and becoming seems to romanticize madness and ignore human suffering. Scientifically dubious. Deleuze and Guattari draw on science metaphorically. Attractors from chaos theory, bodies without organs from biology, but critics argue they misunderstand or misuse scientific concepts. Insufficiently critical. Unlike Derrida's critique or Foucault's genealogy, Deleuze seems to affirm more than critique, potentially ignoring domination and oppression. Defenders argue that Deleuze's concepts, while difficult, open new ways of thinking beyond the impasses of representational thought. His affirmative philosophy counters ressentiment and nihilism without lapsing into naive optimism. His use of science is creative rather than literal, using scientific concepts to think philosophically, not making empirical claims. Legacy. Deleuze's influence extends across philosophy, political theory, film studies, geography, and art. Concepts like rhizome, assemblage, and territorialization have been widely adopted, sometimes in simplified form. His work influenced accelerationism, object-oriented ontology, and new materialism. Where other postmodern thinkers focused on critique and deconstruction, Deleuze offered exuberant construction, wild concepts and visions of a creative, differential, multiple reality. His philosophy is an invitation to think differently, to experiment, to create new concepts and new forms of life. The world for Deleuze is wild, not chaotic meaninglessness, but creative, excessive, overflowing with difference and becoming. Philosophy's task is to affirm and celebrate this wildness, to invent concepts adequate to it, and to participate in its ongoing creation. Baudrillard's nightmare. When reality becomes a copy. Jean Baudrillard, 1929–2007, painted the darkest, most disorienting picture of postmodern society. While other postmodern thinkers retained some critical distance or political hope, Baudrillard seemed to suggest we've entered a new condition where traditional categories, reality/appearance, true/false, authentic/artificial, have collapsed. We live in a world of simulations where copies circulate without originals, where images precede reality, where the distinction between real and fake has become meaningless. This is Baudrillard's nightmare, the disappearance of the real. From symbolic exchange to simulation. Baudrillard began as a Marxist sociologist influenced by semiotics, analyzing consumer society. His early work, The System of Objects, 1968, and The Consumer Society, 1970, extended Marxist critique to consumption. In advanced capitalism, we don't just consume objects for use value, to satisfy needs. We consume signs. A luxury car isn't just transportation. It signifies status, success, identity. Consumption is a language, a system of signs through which we communicate and differentiate ourselves. But Baudrillard grew dissatisfied with Marxist frameworks. Marx distinguished use value, what an object does, from exchange value, what it sells for. Marx criticized capitalism for prioritizing exchange value, turning everything into commodities. But Baudrillard argued that an even more fundamental category preceded use value and exchange value: symbolic exchange. In pre-modern societies, symbolic exchange involved gift-giving, potlatch, sacrifice, non-economic exchanges that create social bonds and meaning. These practices aren't about utility or profit, but about establishing relationships and symbolic meaning. Capitalism destroyed symbolic exchange, reducing everything to economic calculation. Moreover, Baudrillard argued that even use value is a fiction. We don't have natural objective needs that objects satisfy. Needs are produced by the system. Advertising doesn't respond to pre-existing desires, it creates them. The entire system of production and consumption is self-referential, producing subjects and objects, needs and satisfactions. This led Baudrillard beyond Marxism toward a theory of simulation. If both use value and exchange value are fictions generated by the system, if needs are produced rather than given, then what grounds critique? Marx appealed to alienation. Capitalism separated workers from the products of their labor and from their essential nature. But if there's no essential human nature, no objective needs, no ground outside the system, then critique loses its foundation. From symbolic exchange to simulation. In Symbolic Exchange in Death, 1976, and Simulacra and Simulation, 1981, Baudrillard traced the history of simulation through 3 orders of simulacra. First order, the counterfeit, Renaissance to Industrial Revolution. In the first order, images are clearly copies of reality. A painting is a representation of a real scene. A counterfeit coin is a copy of a real coin. The distinction between original and copy, real and representation, is clear. The anxiety is that copies might fool us, but there's still an original reality behind the copy. Second order, production, Industrial Revolution to mid-20th century. In the second order, mass production creates identical copies without originals. A factory produces thousands of identical products. There's no original, all are equally real copies. But they still refer to something real. They're products made from material inputs to satisfy needs, even if those needs are manufactured. Third order, simulation, mid-20th century to present. In the third order, we enter the realm of pure simulation. Copies circulate without originals. Images don't represent reality, they generate it. The map precedes the territory. Models determine the real rather than deriving from it. Baudrillard's famous example, Disneyland. We think Disneyland is an artificial, imaginary space distinct from the real America outside. But Baudrillard argued that Disneyland exists to make the rest of America seem real by comparison. In fact, all of America is Disneyland, a simulation, a hyperreality of images and signs. Disneyland conceals that America itself has become simulation. Similarly, reality TV claims to show real life. But real in reality TV means conforming to televisual expectations, dramatic arcs, emotional revelations, cinematic editing. Reality TV doesn't capture pre-existing reality. It produces a particular kind of performative reality. Then people in actual life model their behavior on reality TV, trying to be real in that televisual sense. The simulation generates what we take to be reality. Hyperreality, more real than real. Baudrillard's most unsettling concept is hyperreality, a condition where simulations become more real than reality itself. Hyperreal images are so polished, perfected, and intensified that they exceed reality. Then reality is judged according to its conformity to hyperreal images. Consider beauty standards. Magazines and advertisements show hyperreal images of beauty, airbrushed, edited, perfected beyond any actual person. Then real people are judged according to these hyperreal standards. Plastic surgery attempts to make real bodies conform to the hyperreal image. The image doesn't represent reality. Reality tries to imitate the image. Or consider war. The first Gulf War, 1991, was, for Baudrillard controversially, a simulation. It was presented as a clean, surgical video game war. Smart bombs hitting targets, night vision footage, CNN coverage. The actual violence, suffering, and death were largely invisible. What circulated were hyperreal images of technological precision. Baudrillard provocatively claimed the Gulf War did not take place, not denying people died, but arguing that the media event, the simulation, overwhelmed the reality. In hyperreality, we can no longer distinguish between real and artificial, original and copy, true and false. Everything is mediated by images, models, and codes. We don't experience reality directly. We experience simulations. And we prefer simulations. They're cleaner, more exciting, more meaningful than messy reality. The precession of simulacra. Baudrillard described 4 phases in the relation between image and reality. 1. The image reflects reality, straightforward representation. 2. The image masks and denatures reality. It distorts. 3. The image masks the absence of reality. It pretends to represent something that doesn't exist. 4. The image has no relation to reality. It is its own pure simulacra. It generates what we take to be reality. In the 4th phase, we've entered the precession of simulacra. Simulations come before and generate reality, rather than being derived from it. The model precedes the real. The menu precedes the meal. The plan precedes the city. The theory precedes the observation. Examples: polling. Polls claim to measure public opinion. But polls shape opinion. People align their views with what polls say is popular. Polls don't reflect reality, they constitute it. Economics. Economic models claim to describe economic behavior. But economic models shape behavior. Markets respond to models, traders use models, policy follows models. Models don't represent the economy, they perform it. DNA. We think of DNA as the blueprint determining biological development. But DNA is itself a model we use to understand complex biological processes. The model precedes and determines what we take to be biological reality. This reversal, where simulations precede and generate reality, defines hyperreality and simulation culture. Implosion and the end of the social. Baudrillard argued that in simulation culture, traditional boundaries collapse or implode. The distinction between real and imaginary, true and false, public and private, production and consumption implode. Most radically, the social itself implodes. Modernity imagined a sphere of social relations, collective life, and public meaning distinct from individual private life. Politics, public opinion, social movements, these constituted the social. But in simulation culture, the social disappears into media, spectacle, and silent majorities. People don't form public opinion or participate in social movements. They consume media images of public opinion and social movements. Polls, surveys, and media events simulate social reality without anyone actually participating. The silent majority doesn't believe, participate, or care. They're passive, indifferent, absorbing images without engagement. This was deeply pessimistic. Where Marxism hoped for revolutionary class consciousness, Baudrillard saw passive consumption. Where Habermas hoped for rational public sphere, Baudrillard saw media spectacle. Where social movements promised resistance, Baudrillard saw simulation and absorption. Seduction, fatal strategies, and the obscene. In later work, Baudrillard moved in even stranger directions. In Seduction, 1979, he contrasted seduction, playful, reversible, superficial, with production, serious, irreversible, deep. Modernity privileged production, making, building, creating. But postmodernity returns to seduction, appearances, surfaces, games. Baudrillard seemed to celebrate seduction over production. Depth, meaning, and truth are modern illusions. Surfaces and appearances aren't superficial, they're where the action is. Authenticity, reality, interiority are boring compared to the playful reversibility of signs and images. In Fatal Strategies 1983, Baudrillard pushed his thought to extremes. Instead of resisting the system's logic, follow it to absurdity. Instead of critiquing simulation, embrace it. The system's own excessive logic will lead to its implosion. This was less a political strategy than a theoretical gesture, Baudrillard playing the prophet of the end times. He also wrote about the obscene, the overexposure of everything. In traditional culture, some things were sacred, hidden, mysterious. But in simulation culture, everything is visible, exposed, hyper-real. Politics becomes reality TV. Private life becomes social media. The body becomes medical imaging. Nothing is left to imagination or mystery. This obscenity, excessive visibility, is another form of the disappearance of the real. Reality disappears in its excessive representation. Critique and controversy. Baudrillard was and is highly controversial. Extreme pessimism. Critics argue Baudrillard offers no hope, no resistance, no politics, just resignation to simulation. Overgeneralization. Not everything is simulation. Material reality, hunger, violence, death persists regardless of media representations. Political irresponsibility. The claim that the Gulf War didn't take place seemed to trivialize real suffering and death. Incoherence. If everything is simulation, how does Baudrillard's own theory escape being simulation? What grounds his claims? Elitist. Baudrillard's dismissal of the silent majority as passive and indifferent ignores resistance, agency, and alternative meanings people create. Defenders argue Baudrillard wasn't claiming nothing is real, but diagnosing a particular cultural condition where distinctions between real and simulated become unstable. His provocations, like the Gulf War essay, were designed to shock people into recognizing how mediation shapes experience, not to deny reality entirely. His pessimism reflected genuine insight into how capitalism and media culture absorb resistance and flatten meaning. Some also argue that Baudrillard shouldn't be read as social theory, making empirical claims, but as provocative philosophical fiction, thought experiments and conceptual provocations rather than literal descriptions. Legacy. Baudrillard's influence spread beyond academia into popular culture. The Matrix, 1999, famously drew on simulacra as simulation. Neo hides contraband in a hollowed-out copy. Concepts like simulation, hyperreality, and the disappearance of the real entered broader cultural conversation, especially discussions of media, technology, and virtual reality. The contemporary moment, where people debate whether we live in a simulation and AI-generated images are indistinguishable from photographs, seems to vindicate Baudrillard's vision. Yet tensions remain. If reality has disappeared into simulation, what grounds critique? If everything is hyperreal, why does Baudrillard's analysis have more truth than Disney's version? If the social has imploded, how do we understand ongoing social movements and political struggles? Baudrillard's nightmare, reality becoming a copy without originals, may be the most extreme postmodern vision. It challenges us to navigate a world where images, models, and simulations increasingly mediate experience, where traditional anchors of meaning and truth seem to float free, where the line between real and fake is no longer clear. Whether this is technological dystopia or just the human condition intensified remains an open question, but Baudrillard forced us to confront it. Postmodernism on trial: critics versus the rebels. Postmodernism never lacked for critics. From the moment it emerged, it faced fierce attacks from multiple directions. Analytic philosophers accused it of incoherence and obscurantism. Marxists charged it with political quietism and complicity with capitalism. Scientists saw it as threatening objective truth. Conservatives blamed it for moral relativism and cultural decay. And even some sympathizers worried it had abandoned the tools needed for critique and emancipation. The trial of postmodernism has been ongoing for decades, producing some of the most heated intellectual debates of our time. The Analytic Philosophers: Clarity Against Obscurity. Anglo-American analytic philosophy, with its emphasis on logical rigor, conceptual clarity, and argumentation, found postmodernism nearly incomprehensible. Philosophers like John Searle, Thomas Nagel, and Martha Nussbaum launched devastating critiques. The charge of obscurantism. Critics argued that postmodern writing, especially Derrida, Lacan, and Kristeva, was deliberately obscure, using jargon and convoluted prose to disguise empty or trivial claims. If you can't express an idea clearly, maybe you don't have a clear idea. The emperor has no clothes. He's just wearing very complicated fabrics that no one dares admit they can't see. Searle's debate with Derrida in the 1970s became legendary. Searle argued that Derrida misunderstood speech act theory and made elementary mistakes about language and meaning. Derrida's response seemed to confirm Searle's suspicions. It was playful, ironic, refusing direct engagement, questioning the framework of debate itself. For Searle, this was intellectual irresponsibility. For Derrida's defenders, it was Searle who missed the point, treating philosophical questions as technical puzzles rather than confronting deeper assumptions. The charge of self-refutation. If postmodernists claim there's no truth, isn't that claim itself a truth claim? If they say all interpretations are equally valid, why should we accept their interpretation? If language can't represent reality, how can their language represent the failure of representation? Critics saw postmodernism as performatively self-contradictory, using the tools of reason and truth to deny reason and truth. Postmodern responses varied. Some, like Richard Rorty, embrace the paradox. We use the tools we have while recognizing their limitations. We can't step outside language to talk about language, but we can become self-conscious about our entanglement in linguistic frameworks. Others denied the charges. Deconstruction doesn't claim anything goes or deny all truth. It reveals complexity and instability in meaning, but that's compatible with pragmatic, contextual truth. The charge of relativism. If truth is relative to frameworks, cultures, or language games, how do we adjudicate between competing claims? If the Aztecs believed human sacrifice was good, and we believe it's evil, and there's no universal moral truth, are both views equally valid? Critics saw this leading to moral paralysis, unable to condemn even the worst atrocities because there's no transcultural moral truth. Postmodernists generally rejected crude relativism. Recognizing that values are culturally constructed doesn't mean all values are equally good. We can critique practices using eminent standards, showing internal contradictions, or comparative judgments. This arrangement causes more suffering than that one, without appealing to universal, context-independent moral truths. Feminists influenced by postmodernism, for instance, could critique patriarchy without claiming to possess universal truth about human nature. Yet the worry persisted. Without firm foundations, doesn't critique become arbitrary? If we can't appeal to reason, truth, or justice as universal standards, what authority do our critiques have? Habermas, the unfinished project of modernity. Jürgen Habermas, the leading inheritor of the Frankfurt School's critical theory, became postmodernism's most sophisticated critic from the left. His The Philosophical Discourse of Modernity, 1985, argued that postmodern thinkers, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Derrida, and Foucault, wrongly abandoned the Enlightenment project. Habermas agreed that instrumental reason, treating everything as means to ends, had colonized life world and distorted communication. But the solution wasn't to reject reason altogether. Instead, we should distinguish instrumental reason from communicative reason, reason oriented toward mutual understanding rather than strategic manipulation. Habermas proposed a theory of communicative rationality. When people engage in genuine dialogue, they implicitly accept norms. They presuppose they can understand each other, give reasons, distinguish better from worse arguments, and reach consensus through the force of the better argument. These presuppositions, built into the pragmatics of communication, provide universal normative standards without metaphysical foundations. Against Foucault, Habermas argued that power and knowledge can be separated. Not all knowledge is bound up with domination. Communicative reason aims at understanding, not control. Against Derrida, he argued that meaning is stable enough for communication and that rational argumentation is possible. Against Lyotard, he insisted we can and should seek rational consensus, not just local language games. For Habermas, postmodernism was neoconservative despite its radical pretensions. By abandoning reason and universalism, it left no grounds for critique or emancipation. It provided tools for deconstructing dominant discourses, but no positive vision of justice or freedom. It dissolved into aesthetic play or resigned acceptance of power. Postmodern responses noted that Habermas's ideal speech situation, free from coercion, with equal access to discourse, was itself utopian and presupposed what needed to be achieved. Moreover, his faith in rational consensus ignored how power operates through reason itself, how supposedly neutral argumentation can marginalize alternative forms of expression, and how consensus can be coercive, suppressing difference. Marxists, postmodernism as capitalist ideology. Marxist critics like Terry Eagleton, Frederick Jameson, and Alex Kalinikos argued that postmodernism was the cultural logic of late capitalism, not a critique of capitalism, but its ideological expression. Jameson's diagnosis, in Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, 1991, Jameson argued that postmodern culture, pastiche, nostalgia, loss of historical depth, emphasis on surfaces, reflected transformations in capitalism. Post-1960s capitalism became more flexible, globalized, and cultural. Production shifted from goods to images, information, and experiences. Culture became economized, economy became culturalized. Postmodern theory, with its skepticism about grand narratives and universal truth, mirrored this fragmentation. It celebrated local struggles and cultural politics while abandoning the possibility of total critique or revolutionary transformation. For Jameson, this was defeatist. We need cognitive mapping, ways of understanding our position within global capitalism, not celebration of fragmentation. Eagleton's polemic. In The Illusions of Postmodernism, 1996, Eagleton attacked postmodernism's political implications. Its relativism undermined grounds for opposing oppression. Its celebration of difference ignored material inequality. Its linguistic idealism, focusing on discourse rather than economic structures, distracted from class struggle. Its rejection of universal human nature abandoned the grounds for universal human rights. Eagleton argued that working-class struggles, anti-colonial movements, and feminist campaigns all appealed to universal values: dignity, justice, freedom. Postmodernist attack on universalism cut the ground from under emancipatory politics. Moreover, postmodernism was elitist, an academic fashion divorced from actual political struggles, speaking to cultural elites while ignoring material exploitation. Kalanikos's charge, in Against Postmodernism, a Marxist Critique, 1989, Kalanikos argued that postmodernism misdiagnosed contemporary capitalism and offered no viable politics. The fragmentation postmodernists celebrated was superficial. Underlying structures of capitalist exploitation remained. Focusing on culture, identity, and discourse ignored political economy. The rejection of class struggle in favor of micropolitics and local resistance played into capitalism's hands, fragmenting opposition. Postmodern responses noted that Marx's own universalism and economicism had marginalized gender, race, sexuality, and ecology. New social movements, feminism, anti-racism, LGBTQ rights, environmentalism, couldn't be reduced to class struggle. Recognizing multiple intersecting forms of oppression rather than prioritizing class was necessary, not a distraction. Moreover, economic struggles themselves involved cultural and discursive dimensions that orthodox Marxism ignored. Yet the Marxist challenge remained. Without structural analysis of capitalism and commitment to transformative politics, does postmodernism leave us with merely symbolic gestures and identitarian fragmentation? Scientists and the science wars. In the 1990s, postmodern approaches to science sparked fierce controversy. Science study scholars influenced by postmodernism, Bruno Latour, Donna Haraway, Sandra Harding, analyzed science as a social practice shaped by culture, gender, and power. They didn't deny scientific knowledge, but contextualized it, showing how social factors influence theory choice, research programs, and what counts as evidence. Scientists reacted with alarm. Were postmodernists claiming science was just another narrative, no better than myth? That scientific facts were social constructions? That gender politics determined what counted as good physics? The Sokal hoax. In 1996, physicist Alan Sokal submitted a parody article transgressing the boundaries toward a transformative hermeneutics of quantum gravity to the cultural studies journal's social text. It was filled with gibberish dressed in postmodern jargon, arguing that quantum gravity supports postmodern and feminist conclusions. The journal published it. Sokal then revealed it was a hoax intended to expose postmodernism's intellectual bankruptcy. The hoax ignited the science wars. Scientists and philosophers accused postmodernists of epistemic relativism, treating scientific theories as social constructions no more true than alternative stories. Misusing science, dropping scientific terms, quantum mechanics, chaos theory, relativity, into cultural theory without understanding them, using physics metaphorically but claiming theoretical support. Undermining authority, casting doubt on scientific expertise and objectivity, contributing to anti-science attitudes. Paul Gross and Norman Levitt's Higher Superstition, 1994, lambasted academic left's hostility to science, blaming postmodernism for promoting irrationalism. They argued that science progresses through objective methods, discovers truths about nature, and shouldn't be relativized by cultural theory. Defenders of science studies responded that they weren't denying scientific knowledge or claiming anything goes. They were analyzing science as a social practice, showing how scientific knowledge is produced through instruments, institutions, funding, networks, and cultural contexts. This doesn't mean results are arbitrary. Nature constrains what theories work, but scientific knowledge isn't simply reading facts off nature. Bruno Latour, a frequent target, argued that he wasn't a relativist, but a relationalist, understanding how truths are established through networks of human and non-human actors. Donna Haraway emphasized situated knowledge, recognizing that all knowledge comes from particular positions, as more objective than the God trick of claiming to see from nowhere. Yet suspicions remained. In an era of climate change denial, vaccine hesitancy, and alternative facts, did postmodern skepticism about scientific authority inadvertently provide intellectual ammunition for anti-science movements? Lyotard himself later expressed regret, wondering if science studies critique had been weaponized by climate deniers. Conservatives, postmodernism, and cultural decay. Conservative critics blamed postmodernism for moral relativism, cultural decay, and political correctness. Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind, 1987, attacked relativism in universities, arguing that refusing to judge between cultures destroyed liberal education. Students taught that all values are relative become cynical, incapable of commitment to truth or virtue. Roger Scruton and other cultural conservatives saw postmodernism as nihilism, destroying traditions and shared meanings. By denying objective truth and beauty, postmodernism reduced culture to power struggles and identity politics. Art became provocative gestures rather than transcendent beauty. Literature became political critique rather than universal human insight. More recently, conservative critics have blamed postmodernism for identity politics, cancel culture, and attacks on Western civilization.
Jordan Peterson argues that postmodern neo-Marxism dominates universities, indoctrinating students with the idea that all hierarchies are oppressive social constructions. This leads to victim mentality and resentment rather than individual responsibility. These critiques often misrepresent postmodernism. Postmodernists didn't create identity politics. Social movements based on race, gender, and sexuality emerged from lived experiences of oppression, not academic theory. Postmodern theory helped analyze these movements but didn't cause them. Moreover, postmodernism often critiqued identity as fixed essence, hardly a support for rigid identity politics. Nor did postmodernism claim anything goes. Recognizing that values are culturally constructed is compatible with strong commitments. You can reject absolute foundations while passionately defending particular values in particular contexts. Yet the conservative challenge raises real questions. Does postmodern skepticism about universals erode shared civic culture? Does emphasis on difference and power undermine possibilities for common ground and dialogue? Feminist ambivalence. Feminism's relationship with postmodernism was complex and conflicted. Postmodern tools helped feminist critique. Derrida's deconstruction revealed how binary oppositions, male, female, reason, emotion, culture, nature, privileged masculine terms. Foucault's analysis of power showed how norms of sexuality and embodiment disciplined women. Butler's performativity theory challenged biological essentialism about gender. Yet many feminists worried that postmodernism undermined feminist politics. If woman is an unstable, deconstructed category, how do we organize women's movements? If gender is performative, does that trivialize the material realities of patriarchy, rape, domestic violence, workplace discrimination? If there's no female subject, who is feminism for? Nancy Fraser and Linda Nicholson distinguished useful from problematic aspects of postmodernism. They advocated postmodern feminism that retained pragmatic essentialism, using categories like women for political organizing while recognizing they're constructed and contested. Martha Nussbaum's fierce attack on Judith Butler crystallized these tensions. She accused Butler of prioritizing theoretical sophistication over practical politics, writing in obscure language that only academic elites could access, and focusing on symbolic subversion rather than material conditions. For Nussbaum, postmodern feminism was a betrayal of feminism's commitment to real women's lives. Butler and others responded that theory and practice aren't opposed. Challenging how categories like woman are constructed is political work. It expands who counts as a woman, resists essentialist definitions, and opens space for queer and trans people. Moreover, difficulty in writing doesn't mean elitism. Some ideas require complex expression. The tension remains. How do we balance recognition that categories are constructed with the need to organize around those categories? How do we critique without foundations while still grounding political struggle? The post-colonial critique. Post-colonial theorists had ambivalent relationships with postmodernism. On the one hand, postmodern critique of universalism, Eurocentrism, and grand narratives aligned with post-colonial challenges to Western imperialism. Postmodernism helped reveal how Western philosophy, science, and culture presented themselves as universal while actually being particular and dominant. On the other hand, post-colonial critics like Benita Perry and Ayajaz Ahmad worried that postmodernism's emphasis on textuality, discourse, and deconstruction ignored material realities of imperialism, economic exploitation, and violence. Focusing on representations and cultural identities distracted from political economy and anti-colonial struggle. Edward Said's Orientalism used Foucauldian discourse analysis to show how Western representations of the Orient constructed the East as exotic, backward, and irrational, justifying colonial domination. This was hugely influential. Yet Said also warned against purely textualist approaches that lost sight of real history and politics. Gayatri Spivak engaged deeply with Derrida while critiquing postmodernism's universalizing tendencies. Her famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, argued that even well-meaning Western intellectuals speaking for oppressed groups could silence them. Post-colonial theory needed to recognize its own complicity rather than claiming to represent the voiceless. Deepesh Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe challenged European universalism while resisting simple rejection. European concepts, democracy, rights, history, had been adopted and transformed by non-European movements. The task wasn't to reject European thought entirely, but to recognize its provinciality, showing how different traditions might tell different stories. The post-colonial, postmodern relationship thus involved productive tension, using postmodern tools while resisting postmodernism's potential to become another Western theoretical imperialism. The verdict? Has postmodernism been convicted or acquitted? The trial continues. Critics successfully identified problems. Obscurity and elitism. Some postmodern writing is unnecessarily difficult, accessible only to academic specialists. Political ambiguity. Postmodernism's relationship to progressive politics is unclear. It provided critical tools but also seemed to undermine grounds for committed action. Relativism risks. While postmodernists usually rejected crude relativism, their skepticism about universal truth and reason created risks of sliding into anything goes. Misuses. Postmodern concepts were often simplified, distorted, or weaponized in ways their originators didn't intend. Yet, defenders could claim necessary critique. Postmodernism revealed real problems with Enlightenment universalism, foundationalism, and progressive narratives. Productive tools. Deconstruction, genealogy, and discourse analysis enabled important critiques of power, identity, and knowledge. Enabling movements. Postmodern theory helped feminism, queer theory, postcolonial studies, and other movements challenge naturalized hierarchies. Honest about complexity. Reality is complex, messy, and contested. Postmodernism refused false simplifications. Perhaps the most balanced verdict. Postmodernism was necessary but insufficient. It successfully challenged modernist certainties and exposed hidden assumptions. It opened space for marginalized voices and alternative perspectives. But taken to extremes, it risked political paralysis, relativism, and detachment from material struggles. The trial of postmodernism is also a trial of ourselves. Can we live without foundations? Can we navigate ethical and political life recognizing contingency and multiplicity? Can we commit to values while acknowledging they're contestable? These questions remain open. From art to science, how postmodernism took over everything. Postmodernism began as a philosophical movement,
but it metastasized, spreading from philosophy into literature, architecture, art, film, music, and eventually into politics, science, law, religion, and everyday culture. By the 1990s, postmodern described everything from buildings to TV shows to marketing strategies. How did an esoteric philosophical tendency become a pervasive cultural condition? And what happened when postmodern sensibilities infiltrated domains far from their origin? Architecture, the decorated shed. Postmodern architecture was perhaps the most visible and controversial manifestation. Modernist architecture, exemplified by Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, and the International style, embraced clean lines, functional forms, rejection of ornamentation, and universal principles. Form follows function. Buildings should express their purpose honestly, using modern materials, steel, glass, concrete, to create rational, efficient spaces. By the 1960s, modernist architecture faced a backlash. Critics like Jane Jacobs attacked modernist urban planning for destroying communities and creating sterile, inhuman spaces. Residents disliked the stark, imposing buildings that ignored local context and history. Robert Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, 1966, and Learning from Las Vegas, 1972, launched postmodern architecture. Venturi celebrated complexity, ambiguity, and ornamentation over modernist purity. He distinguished ducts, buildings whose structure expresses their meaning, from decorated sheds, conventional structures with applied decoration. Rather than scorning decorated sheds, Venturi embraced them. Why not learn from commercial vernacular architecture, strip malls, casinos, billboards, instead of imposing high modernist forms? Postmodern architecture incorporated historical references, irony, and playfulness. Philip Johnson's AT&T building, 1984, topped a glass skyscraper with a Chippendale pediment, classical ornamentation on a modern form, mixing styles ironically. Michael Graves used bright colors, geometric shapes, and classical motifs in buildings that referenced history without reverence. Frank Gehry created buildings like Bilbao Guggenheim that celebrated sculptural form over functionalist rationality. Critics charged postmodern architecture with superficiality, pastiche without meaning, ironic kitsch masquerading as sophistication. Prince Charles famously attacked modernist and postmodern architecture alike, preferring traditional forms. Others appreciated postmodern architecture's vitality, diversity, and engagement with popular culture over modernist elitism. Postmodern architecture demonstrated a key feature of postmodernism across domains: rejection of modernist purism and universalism in favor of eclecticism, irony, and contextual sensitivity. Literature, metafiction, and fragmentation. Postmodern literature emerged from late modernism but radicalized its techniques. Where modernists like Joyce and Woolf fragmented narrative to represent consciousness more authentically, postmodernists fragmented narrative to reveal fiction's artificiality. Key postmodern literary features: metafiction, stories that draw attention to their own fictionality. John Bart's Lost in the Funhouse contains stories about writing stories. Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveler addresses the reader directly, constantly starting and interrupting narratives. Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five mixes science fiction with autobiography, repeatedly reminding readers it's a novel about writing a novel. Intertextuality, dense networks of references to other texts. Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow alludes to countless cultural texts, high and low, historical and fictional. Readers become detectives tracing connections rather than passive consumers of plot. Pastiche and parody, mixing styles and genres without modernist anxiety about authenticity. Don DeLillo, Kathy Acker, and William Burroughs blended fiction with documentary, advertising slogans, bureaucratic language, and pop culture. Temporal experimentation, nonlinear narratives, fragmented chronology, alternate histories. Borges' fictions imagined infinite libraries and forking paths. Philip K. Dick created alternate realities and questioned what's real. Playfulness and irony. Writers like Donald Barthelme created absurd, minimalist stories resisting interpretation. David Foster Wallace combined irony with sincerity, creating encyclopedic fictions that were both playful and desperately serious. Postmodern literature questions storytelling itself. Do narratives distort reality? Can language represent truth? Is coherent selfhood a fiction? These philosophical questions became literary form, stories that enacted rather than just discussed the problems of representation, identity, and meaning. Critics complained that postmodern literature was narcissistic, obsessed with its own processes rather than engaging with real human experience. Its irony created emotional distance, preventing genuine feeling or moral commitment. Its difficulty alienated ordinary readers, serving academic interpreters rather than general audiences. Defenders argued postmodern literature honestly confronted contemporary conditions: fragmentation, media saturation, loss of stable meaning. It resisted becoming another commodity easily consumed, demanding active, critical readers. Its self-consciousness was epistemological honesty, acknowledging that all representation involves construction and interpretation. Visual art, from pop to appropriation. Postmodern art rejected modernist notions of originality, genius, and progress toward pure abstraction. Pop art in the 1960s, Andy Warhol's Campbell soup cans, Roy Lichtenstein's comic panels, challenged distinctions between high art and popular culture, original and reproduction. Warhol's factory-produced silkscreens questioned artistic authenticity and authorship. By the 1980s, postmodern art strategies dominated. Appropriation. Artists like Sherry Levine photographed photographs, creating identical copies and calling them original artworks, challenging ideas of originality and authorship. Richard Prince rephotographed Marlboro ads, slightly altering them to critique advertising and masculinity. Simulation and hyperreality. Artists like Jeff Koons created slick, kitschy sculptures of balloon animals and porcelain Michael Jackson. These works celebrated rather than critiqued consumer culture, occupying an ambiguous zone between critical irony and complicit celebration. Identity and representation. Barbara Kruger overlaid images with text, "Your body is a battleground," challenging how media represents women. Cindy Sherman photographed herself in various costumes and roles, exploring how identity is performed and constructed through representation. Adrian Piper and Lorna Simpson addressed race and identity. Installation and conceptual art. Artists created immersive environments or reduced art to concepts and documentation, questioning what counts as art. Hans Haacke exposed corporate and political power structures supporting museums. Postmodern art was criticized as cynical, empty, and complicit with market forces it claimed to critique. Koons's kitsch sold for millions. Was this critique or celebration of commodification? Hal Foster distinguished postmodernism of resistance, critical, political, from postmodernism of reaction, celebratory, market-driven, arguing much postmodern art fell into the latter category. Yet, postmodern art strategies opened questions about authorship, originality, and the institutional structures of the art world that modernism had naturalized. It made visible the market, gender politics, and racial dynamics structuring art production and reception. Film, pastiche, self-reference, and genre bending. Postmodern cinema mixed genres, played with film history, and blurred boundaries between high and low culture. Key examples: Blade Runner, 1982. Ridley Scott's neo-noir science fiction mixed film noir aesthetics with cyberpunk, raising questions about memory, identity, and what's human, themes resonating with postmodern philosophy. Blue Velvet, 1986. David Lynch combined suburban innocence with surreal violence, film noir with soap opera, creating disturbing beauty that resisted interpretation. Pulp Fiction, 1994. Quentin Tarantino's nonlinear narrative, dense intertextual references to film history, stylized violence, and ironic humor exemplified postmodern cinema. It was pastiche, mixing genres and styles, that celebrated rather than critiqued popular culture. The Matrix, 1999. The Wachowskis adapted Baudrillard's simulation theory, literally showing Neo with a copy of Simulacra and Simulation,
cyberpunk aesthetics, and Hong Kong action cinema, creating a philosophically inflected blockbuster. Run Lola Run, 1998. Tom Tykwer's film repeated the same scenario 3 times with different outcomes, playing with contingency, gaming aesthetics, and narrative structure. Postmodern film techniques included pastiche, mixing genres and styles without hierarchical distinction between high and low culture. Self-reflexivity, films commenting on cinema itself, drawing attention to their constructedness. Intertextuality, dense networks of references to film history and popular culture. Irony and ambiguity, resisting clear moral messages or definitive interpretations. Fragmented narrative, non-linear storytelling, multiple perspectives, temporal loops. TV also became postmodern. The Simpsons and Seinfeld combined self-referential humor with cultural critique. Twin Peaks mixed soap opera with surrealism. Later, Community and Rick and Morty intensified postmodern techniques, meta-commentary, genre parody, and narrative experimentation. Critics worried postmodern film and TV's irony and pastiche prevented genuine emotional engagement or political critique. Everything became reference and quotation, surfaces without depth. Defenders argued these techniques honestly reflected media-saturated culture while creating new possibilities for meaning. Music, sampling, eclecticism, and genre collapse. Postmodern music embraced eclecticism, pastiche, and sampling. Classical postmodern composers like John Cage used chance operations, challenging ideas of authorial control and musical meaning. Philip Glass and Steve Reich created minimalistic repetitive structures, rejecting romantic expressiveness and modernist complexity. But postmodern music flourished most in popular culture. Hip-hop. Sampling, taking snippets of existing recordings and recontextualizing them, embodied postmodern aesthetics. DJs and producers created new music from fragments of old music, challenging ideas about originality and authorship. Hip-hop was intertextual, referencing musical history while creating something new. It also challenged high-low distinctions, taking sounds from anywhere, funk, soul, rock, classical, TV themes, and making art. Electronic and dance music. Genres like house, techno, and drum and bass emphasize technological production, mechanical repetition, and somatic experience over traditional musical expression. These were music for bodies moving in space, not contemplative listening to authorial genius. Indie and alternative rock. Bands like Pavement, Beck, and Radiohead mix styles eclectically, combining irony with sincerity, lo-fi aesthetics with technological experimentation. Genre collapse. By the 2000s, streaming and internet culture accelerated genre mixing. Artists combined hip-hop, R&B, rock, electronic, dance, country, and global music traditions freely. The idea of pure genres gave way to fluid, eclectic styles. Postmodern music challenged modernist ideas about progress, authenticity, and genius. It democratized creation. Sampling meant anyone with equipment could make music. It questioned boundaries between composition and performance, original and copy, musician and listener, especially in remix culture. Critics charged that sampling was theft, that eclecticism was superficial, that technology replaced human feeling. Defenders argued postmodern music honestly engaged with technological conditions, created new aesthetic possibilities, and democratized cultural production. Politics, identity, fragmentation, and the culture wars. Postmodernism's political implications were deeply contested. On the one hand, postmodern theory informed progressive social movements. Deconstruction helped feminists analyze gendered binaries. Foucault's power analysis informed activism around prisons, sexuality, and psychiatry. Recognition of multiple, intersecting forms of oppression, intersectionality,
coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, resonated with postmodern emphasis on difference and multiplicity. Identity politics, organizing around gender, race, sexuality, disability, aligned with postmodern skepticism about universal human nature and recognition of constructed identities. If identities are constructed through power and discourse, they can be contested and transformed.
Yet postmodernism also seemed to undermine progressive politics. If truth is relative, how do we argue for justice? If grand narratives are dead, what about the narrative of liberation from oppression? If categories like woman or black are unstable, how do we organize around them? This created strange bedfellows in the culture wars of the 1980s-90s. Conservative critics blamed postmodernism for moral relativism, political correctness, and the tax on Western civilization. But some leftists also attacked postmodernism as politically defeatist, substituting cultural critique for material politics, fragmenting solidarity through identity politics, and abandoning class struggle. Meanwhile, neoliberalism, the economic and political regime emerging from the 1970s onward, had its own postmodern features: flexibility, deregulation, the dismantling of grand social projects. Some critics argued postmodernism was complicit with neoliberalism, both celebrating fragmentation, fluidity, and entrepreneurial selves while dismantling collective institutions and shared commitments. Others countered that postmodern theory could critique neoliberalism by revealing how its rhetoric of freedom and choice masked new forms of control and inequality. The relationship between postmodernism and contemporary politics remains contested. Science and technology, cyberculture, and the virtual. Postmodern theory influenced how we think about science and technology. Cyberculture in the 1990s, virtual reality, cyberspace, the early internet, resonated with postmodern themes. Simulation, artificial intelligence, cyborg identities, the blurring of real and virtual. Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, 1985, embraced the figure of the cyborg, part human, part machine, to challenge natural/artificial and human, non-human boundaries. Instead of seeing technology as alienating, Haraway imagined it as enabling new forms of embodiment and identity. Science fiction became a favorite postmodern genre. William Gibson's Neuromancer, Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, and later The Matrix explored virtual realities, simulations, and uploaded consciousness. These weren't just entertainment, but thought experiments about postmodern conditions. The internet itself seemed postmodern. Decentralized, rhizomatic, hypertext, links connecting text non-linearly, anonymous identities, user-generated content challenging authorship and authority. Early internet utopians celebrated its democratic, anarchic potential. By the 2000s, digital culture intensified postmodern features. Social media profiles as constructed selves, memes as intertextual pastiche, viral content collapsing distinctions between original and copy, fake news and deepfakes challenging truth, filter bubbles fragmenting shared reality. Some celebrated this as democratization and creativity. Others worried about post-truth politics, algorithmic control, and surveillance capitalism. Postmodern theory provided tools for analyzing these developments, but also faced accusations of contributing to epistemic chaos. Law and religion, deconstruction meets doctrine. Postmodernism even infiltrated law and religion. Critical legal studies, influenced by deconstruction, argued that legal interpretation is indeterminate. Texts don't determine outcomes, interpretive communities do. This challenged legal formalism's claim that law objectively applies rules to facts. In religious studies, postmodern approaches questioned essentialist definitions of religion, explored how religious identities are constructed, and analyzed sacred texts using deconstructive methods. Some theologians embraced postmodern themes, developing death of God theology or emphasizing religion as practice rather than doctrine. These moves were controversial. Conservative legal scholars defended objectivity and rule of law against what they saw as nihilistic skepticism.
Traditional believers worried postmodern approaches undermined religious truth and authority. Pervasiveness and problems. By the 1990s, postmodern described everything, often losing precise meaning. Advertising used postmodern techniques, irony, pastiche, self-reference to sell products. Fashion mixed styles eclectically. Video games created non-linear, player-driven narratives. This pervasiveness created problems. When everything is postmodern, the term becomes meaningless. Moreover, postmodern techniques, initially critical and subversive, were absorbed by consumer capitalism.
Irony sold cars. Transgression became trendy. Critique became commodity. Some postmodern thinkers recognized this. Jameson argued that postmodernism was the cultural logic of late capitalism, not outside or opposed to it, but expressing it. The question became, can postmodern critique resist absorption, or is resistance futile once you're inside the system? Yet postmodernism's spread also testified to its insights. It captures something real about contemporary experience: fragmentation, media saturation, loss of stable foundations, mixing of high and low culture, emphasis on surfaces and images. Whether this was cause for mourning, loss of depth, meaning, truth, or celebration, liberation from oppressive universals, democratic culture, remain debated. From architecture to science, art to politics, postmodernism reshaped how we think and create. Whether this was contagion or necessary adaptation, catastrophe or opportunity, depends on your perspective. But by the turn of the millennium, postmodern sensibilities had indeed taken over everything, for better or worse.
Where it fails: myths, misunderstandings, and edge cases. Postmodernism's critics identified real failures, limitations, and blind spots. Some criticisms were based on misunderstandings, attacking straw versions of postmodernism, but others hit genuine weaknesses. Understanding where postmodernism fails and where it's merely misunderstood is crucial for assessing its value and limits. Myth 1: postmodernism denies reality exists. The misunderstanding. Critics often claim postmodernists believe reality doesn't exist, that everything is just text or discourse, that there's no objective world beyond human construction. The reality. Most postmodernists don't deny external reality. Derrida's "there is nothing outside the text" doesn't mean rocks and trees don't exist. It means we can't access reality except through interpretive frameworks. Baudrillard's simulation theory doesn't deny material reality. It diagnoses how images and models mediate experience. Foucault analyzed institutions, practices, bodies, material realities. Where it actually fails? While postmodernists don't deny reality, they sometimes write as if only discourse matters. Foucault's emphasis on discourse and representation sometimes obscures material causes: economic structures, biological constraints, environmental factors. The focus on texts and signs can distract from material suffering and structural inequality. The real criticism isn't that postmodernism denies reality, but that it lacks tools for analyzing material reality beyond discourse. This is why Marxists and materialist feminists criticized postmodernism, not for denying reality, but for inadequate attention to political economy, biology, and physical structures. Myth 2: postmodernism says all views are equally valid, relativism. The misunderstanding: if there's no universal truth, then all perspectives are equally good. Science is just one narrative among many, no better than myth. Moral judgments are merely cultural preferences. The reality: postmodernists generally reject crude relativism. Recognizing that truth is contextual, perspectival, and constructed doesn't mean anything goes. Within contexts, there are better and worse claims, arguments, and interpretations. Science works. It produces reliable knowledge and successful technologies, even if it doesn't access absolute metaphysical truth. Postmodernists distinguish their position from relativism by emphasizing pragmatic, contextual standards rather than universal, absolute ones. We can judge claims without appealing to God's eye view or foundations outside all perspectives.
Where it actually fails? Despite rejecting crude relativism, postmodernists struggles to articulate robust grounds for critique and judgment. If all frameworks are historically contingent constructions shaped by power, what makes one framework better than another? On what grounds do we oppose injustice if we can't appeal to universal human nature, truth, or reason? Postmodernists offer various responses: eminent critique, revealing internal contradictions; pragmatic judgments, which arrangements reduce suffering; ethical responses to otherness, Levinas, Derrida. But these often feel ad hoc, lacking the systematic grounding that traditional philosophy provided. The risk is that postmodern critique becomes arbitrary. We oppose things we don't like but can't justify why others should agree. This is a real problem, not a misunderstanding. Postmodernism destabilizes foundations but doesn't clearly establish what replaces them. Some see this as honest. We must act without foundations. Others see it as insufficient for sustaining ethical and political commitments. Myth 3. Postmodernism is purely negative and nihilistic. The misunderstanding. Postmodernism only deconstructs and critiques, offering nothing positive. It's nihilistic, destructive, and despairing. The reality. While postmodernism emphasizes critique, many postmodern thinkers offer positive visions. Deleuze celebrated creativity, difference, and becoming. Foucault's later work explored practices of self-formation and care of the self. Derrida's ethics emphasized justice as an impossible but necessary commitment. Rorty advocated pragmatic liberalism. Feminist and post-colonial theorists used postmodern tools for emancipatory projects. Moreover, destabilizing foundations can be liberating rather than nihilistic.
If categories like gender, race, and sexuality are constructed, they can be reconstructed differently. If knowledge is produced within power relations, marginalized knowledges can challenge dominant ones. Where it actually fails, postmodernism's critical orientation sometimes overshadows constructive proposals. It's clearer about what it opposes, foundationalism, universalism, grand narratives, than what it supports. When postmodernists do offer positive visions, they often seem vague or utopian. Justice to come, democracy as interminable questioning, ethics of radical otherness. This creates political frustration. Activists need concrete goals and shared principles. Postmodernism offers sophisticated critique but limited guidance for building movements, institutions, or alternative arrangements. Its strength, destabilizing naturalized assumptions, becomes a weakness when construction is needed. Myth 4. Postmodernism is just academic jargon and word games. The misunderstanding. Postmodern writing is deliberately obscure to hide empty ideas. It's meaningless jargon pretending to profundity. The reality. Some postmodern writing is genuinely difficult because it's wrestling with complex philosophical problems. How language works, how meaning is possible, how we can think without foundations. Concepts like deference, simulacra, and rhizomes are technical terms, like terms in any specialized discourse. Moreover, some postmodernists, particularly Derrida, deliberately perform complexity in their writing. If language is unstable and meaning is never fully present, then writing that enacts this instability rather than pretending to transparent communication is philosophically appropriate. Where it actually fails, some postmodern writing is unnecessarily obscure. Jargon proliferates, sentences become labyrinthine, arguments rely on wordplay more than logic. The so-called hoax exposed that postmodern journals would publish gibberish if it used the right vocabulary and cited the right names. This obscurity has consequences. It limits postmodern theory to academic specialists, making it inaccessible to broader audiences and practitioners. It breeds intellectual insularity. Ideas circulate within small communities without external scrutiny. It invites parody and dismissal. Not all postmodernists are equally culpable. Rorty wrote clearly. Foucault, in interviews, explained accessibly. But the tendency toward obscurity is a real failure, not just a misunderstanding. Theory that can't communicate beyond specialists limits its own political and cultural impact. Myth 5.
Postmodernism invented identity politics. The misunderstanding. Postmodern theory caused identity politics, political correctness, and divisive focus on race, gender, and sexuality rather than universal human concerns or class solidarity. The reality. Identity-based social movements emerged from lived experiences, not academic theory. The civil rights movement, second-wave feminism, gay liberation all preceded postmodern theory's peak influence. People organized around shared identities because those identities were sites of oppression and exclusion. Postmodern theory helped analyze these movements and identities, showing how categories like race and gender are socially constructed, how power operates through identity categories, how representation matters. But it didn't create the movements. Where it actually fails, postmodern theory's complicated relationship with identity creates tensions. On the one hand, it destabilizes identity categories, showing they're constructed and unstable. On the other hand, political movements need categories to organize around. This leads to uncomfortable paradoxes. Feminists using woman while acknowledging there's no essential womanhood. Anti-racist movements organizing around race while arguing race is a social fiction. Moreover, postmodern emphasis on difference and multiplicity can fragment solidarity. If we focus on how every identity is different, race, gender, sexuality, class, disability, etc. intersect infinitely, how do we build coalitions? If universal claims are suspect, how do we appeal to shared humanity or justice? Some criticisms of identity politics justifiably target how it's practiced. Purity spirals, victimhood competition, policing language. While postmodernism didn't cause these problems, its theoretical tools sometimes lack resources for addressing them.
Emphasis on difference over commonality, particularity over universality, and destabilization over solidarity can exacerbate fragmentation. Genuine failure 1. Inadequate political economy. Postmodernism's focus on culture, discourse, and identity often neglects political economy, how capitalism structures material life. Foucault analyzed power brilliantly but said little about economic exploitation. Derrida deconstructed texts but rarely analyzed capitalism systematically. Lyotard diagnosed postmodernism but didn't theorize how commodification and market logic work. This isn't just an oversight, it reflects postmodernism's break with Marxism and materialism. But the result is that postmodern theory often operates at cultural and discursive levels without grasping economic structures. It can analyze how consumer culture produces identities but struggles to explain why capitalism produces inequality, why crises recur, how exploitation persists. This limited postmodernism's political relevance. Economic crises, 2008 financial crisis, austerity, rising inequality, demanded analysis of capitalism's structural dynamics, not just cultural critique. Movements like Occupy Wall Street needed political economy more than discourse analysis. Recent attempts to integrate postmodern insights with political economy, Nancy Fraser's work, for instance, suggest this failure can be addressed. But mainstream postmodernism's neglect of economics remains a genuine weakness. Genuine failure 2, insufficient attention to nature and biology. Postmodernism's social constructionism sometimes ignores biological and ecological realities. If everything is constructed through discourse and culture, what about bodies, biology, evolution, environment, non-human animals, climate? Judith Butler's performativity theory analyzes gender as culturally constructed performance. But critics ask, what about hormones, chromosomes, reproductive biology? Doesn't reducing everything to performance ignore material embodiment? Similarly, environmental issues, climate change, species extinction, resource depletion, involve material, biological, physical realities not reducible to discourse. We can analyze how climate change is represented, but carbon in the atmosphere isn't a social construction.
Some postmodern theorists addressed this. Donna Haraway developed cyborg theory and companion species theory, engaging with biology and technology. Bruno Latour's actor network theory included non-human actors. But mainstream postmodernism often seemed trapped in linguistic and cultural analysis, unable to adequately theorize nature and biology. This matters because urgent political challenges, pandemics, climate crisis, biotechnology require thinking about biology and ecology, not just culture and discourse. Postmodernism needs better tools for engaging with material, natural, and biological realities without lapsing into naive realism or ignoring how science is socially shaped. Genuine Failure 3, Problems with Self-Reflexivity. Postmodernism's self-reflexive critique creates paradoxes. If all knowledge is situated and power-laden, what about postmodern theory itself? If grand narratives are dead, isn't the death of grand narratives itself a grand narrative? If meaning is unstable, why should we trust postmodern accounts of meaning's instability? Postmodernists acknowledged these paradoxes. Derrida admitted deconstruction can be deconstructed. Lyotard recognized that diagnosing postmodernicity involved meta-discourse he supposedly rejected. Foucault struggled with how to ground critique without appealing to universal norms he'd undermined. But acknowledging performative contradiction doesn't resolve it. Critics argued these paradoxes weren't interesting ironies, but fatal flaws. How can postmodernism claim truth for the claim that truth is constructed? How can it critique power from within power without any external standpoint? Various responses have been offered. Pragmatism, we use tools we have while recognizing limits. Eminent critique, revealing contradictions internal to discourses. Strategic essentialism, temporarily using categories we know are constructed. But none fully satisfies. This isn't just misunderstanding, it's a genuine philosophical problem postmodernism generates but doesn't solve. Genuine Failure 4, Absorption by Consumer Capitalism. Postmodern critique aimed to destabilize dominant power structures.
But postmodern aesthetics, irony, pastiche, transgression, self-reference were quickly absorbed by advertising, marketing, and consumer culture. Irony sells products. Rebellion becomes branding. Transgression becomes trendy. This wasn't just co-optation from outside. Some postmodern art and theory seemed complicit with consumer capitalism from the start, celebrating surfaces, shopping, and commodification. Was Jeff Koons critiquing or celebrating kitsch? Was Madonna's appropriation of queer culture subversive or exploitative? Did postmodern architecture challenge or serve corporate clients? Frederick Jameson's critique, that postmodernism is the cultural logic of late capitalism, suggested postmodernism wasn't external opposition, but internal expression of capitalist culture. If so, postmodern critique may be toothless, unable to bite the system it's embedded within. This points to a strategic failure. If every subversive gesture gets commodified, if critique becomes spectacle, if resistance is marketed, then postmodern tools may be inadequate for challenging capitalism. More confrontational, organizational, or economic strategies may be needed. Genuine Failure 5, Limited Tools for Solidarity and Coalition. Postmodernism's emphasis on difference, multiplicity, and particularity makes building solidarity difficult. If identities are multiple and fragmented, if there's no shared human nature, if universal claims are suspect, what brings people together politically? Effective political movements need shared goals, common principles, and solidaristic commitments across differences. But postmodernism destabilizes the grounds for these. Identity politics can fragment into ever smaller groups. Critique of essentialism makes organizing around categories difficult. Skepticism about universals undermines appeals to human rights or justice. Some postmodern influence theorists address this. Judith Butler's work on coalitional politics, Chantal Mouffe's radical democracy, Iris Marion Young's politics of difference. But tensions remain. How do we balance recognition of difference with need for unity? How do we build coalitions without suppressing particularity? This isn't just theoretical, it's practical. Progressive movements struggle with fragmentation and purity politics. Postmodernism provided tools for recognizing difference, but fewer for building commonality. This is a real limitation for political practice. Edge cases, when postmodernism goes too far. Certain applications of postmodern ideas seem to go too far, becoming absurd or harmful. Science denial. When postmodern skepticism about objectivity is used to deny climate change, evolution, or vaccine efficacy, it's been misapplied harmfully. While science studies rightly show science is socially shaped, this doesn't mean scientific claims are arbitrary or equivalent to non-scientific claims. Epistemic anarchism. When anything goes becomes the principle, we lose capacity to distinguish better from worse claims. While postmodernism doesn't endorse crude relativism, some applications slide toward epistemic anarchism that's intellectually and practically problematic. Narcissistic textual play. When deconstruction becomes endless wordplay detached from material concerns, it's self-indulgent. If analysis never moves beyond showing texts undermine themselves, it becomes sterile academic exercise. Performative wokeness. When identity politics becomes performative displays of correctness rather than substantive change, it's been distorted. While postmodern theory helped analyze identity and power, reducing politics to policing language and performing identities is a failure. These edge cases suggest limits. Postmodern insights need to be balanced with other considerations: material realities, pragmatic judgments, political effectiveness, basic epistemic standards. Conclusion: real failures, real contributions. Postmodernism genuinely fails in several ways: inadequate political economy, insufficient attention to nature and biology, absorption by capitalism, problems with self-reflexivity, limited tools for solidarity. These aren't just misunderstandings but real weaknesses. Yet many criticisms misrepresent postmodernism, attacking straw versions rather than actual positions. And despite failures, postmodernism made real contributions, challenging false universals, revealing how power operates through knowledge and identity, opening space for marginalized voices, destabilizing naturalized hierarchies. The task is neither wholesale rejection nor uncritical embrace, but careful discrimination, taking what's valuable while recognizing limits, integrating postmodern insights with other theoretical resources, and adapting postmodern tools to contemporary challenges. Postmodernism is neither savior nor devil, but a complex, flawed, productive body of thought we're still working through. The afterlife of postmodernism. Why it still matters today. Is postmodernism dead? Countless obituaries have been written. Critics declared it a passing fad, a 1980s-90s academic fashion now mercifully behind us. The term itself fell out of favor. Few contemporary theorists identify as postmodern. Major figures, Derrida, Baudrillard, Lyotard, Foucault, are dead. The cultural and political conditions that produced postmodernism have shifted. Yet reports of postmodernism's death are exaggerated. Its concepts, methods, and sensibilities persist, sometimes under different names, sometimes unacknowledged. The questions postmodernism raised remain urgent. Its failures and successes shape contemporary thought. Postmodernism has an afterlife, haunting theory and culture even when not named. Understanding this afterlife helps us grasp our current moment. Metamorphosis, postmodernism and its variants. Several theoretical movements emerged from and beyond postmodernism. Altermodernism and metamodernism, terms proposed to describe culture after postmodernism, combining postmodern skepticism with renewed sincerity, irony with earnestness, fragmentation with attempts at wholeness.
Metamodernism, articulated by Timotheus Vermeulen and Robin van den Akker, describes an oscillation between modern and postmodern sensibilities, neither returning to naive modernism nor remaining in postmodern irony, but moving between poles. Examples include new sincerity in film and literature, directors like Wes Anderson and Charlie Kaufman combining formal experimentation with genuine emotion, musicians like Sufjan Stevens mixing irony with vulnerability. These works don't abandon postmodern techniques, but infuse them with affect and meaning postmodernism allegedly lacked. Object-oriented ontology and speculative realism. Philosophical movements reacting against postmodern correlationalism, the idea that we can only think about correlations between thought and world, never world in itself. Philosophers like Graham Harman, Quentin Meillassoux, and Jane Bennett argue for accessing reality beyond human perspectives and discourse. This is explicitly anti-postmodern, seeking to move beyond linguistic turn and social constructionism. Yet, these movements inherit postmodern tools: critique of human exceptionalism, attention to non-human actors, Lyotard's influence, skepticism about stable essences. They're reactions against postmodernism that remain shaped by it. New materialism. Feminist theorists like Karen Barad, Rosie Braidotti, and Jane Bennett develop materialisms that incorporate postmodern insights while re-engaging with matter, bodies, and nature. Unlike vulgar materialism that reduces everything to matter, new materialism sees matter as dynamic, agental, and entangled with discourse. It retains postmodern skepticism about essentialism while rejecting pure social constructionism. Accelerationism. Left and right accelerationist movements embrace technological and economic acceleration, arguing we should push capitalism's tendencies to extremes rather than resist them. Nick Snersik, Alex Williams, Nick Land, these thinkers combine Deleuze's philosophy of becoming with Marxist political economy, creating strange hybrids of postmodern and modernist thought. These movements suggest postmodernism's dissolution into successor projects, neither simply continuing postmodernism nor completely breaking from it, but metabolizing its insights while addressing its failures. Persistence. Postmodern concepts still at work. Many postmodern concepts remain active, even when not labeled postmodern. Intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw's concept, central to contemporary social justice discourse, resonates with postmodern emphasis on multiple, intersecting identities and power relations. Analyzing how race, gender, class, sexuality, disability, etc. intersects reflects postmodern rejection of single-axis analysis. Discourse and framing. Political analysis routinely uses Foucauldian notions of discourse, how language shapes reality, how framing determines what's visible and thinkable. Politicians, activists, and analysts understand that controlling discourse is wielding power. Performativity. Butler's gender performativity influenced not just queer theory, but broader understanding of identity as enacted and constructed. Sociologists, psychologists, and ordinary people increasingly understand identity as something we do rather than something we are. Understanding this afterlife.
The idea that categories like race, gender, sexuality, disability, and even scientific concepts are socially constructed remains widespread, sometimes crudely simplified but reflecting postmodern insights. Deconstruction as method. Close reading that reveals text instabilities, contradictions, and blind spots remains common in humanities and cultural criticism, even when not explicitly called deconstruction. Situated knowledge. The recognition that knowledge comes from particular positions and perspectives, Haraway's situated knowledge's standpoint theory reflects postmodern rejection of view from nowhere. These concepts' persistence shows postmodernism's influence even when its name has faded. Digital culture, postmodernism intensified. If postmodernism diagnosed cultural conditions in late 20th century, digital culture intensifies those conditions. Simulation and hyperreality. Baudrillard's concepts seem prophetic of social media, where curated profiles simulate ideal selves, filters create hyperreal images, and people experience life through phones, documenting for Instagram rather than being present. The line between authentic and performed, real and virtual, increasingly blurs. Information overload and fragmentation. Lyotard's little narratives proliferate exponentially online. No shared reality, just filter bubbles and echo chambers. Grand narratives fragment into countless micro-narratives, YouTube channels, podcasts, Reddit communities, each with its own truth. Meme culture as postmodern pastiche. Memes are pure postmodern form, intertextual, iterative, playfully mixing high and low culture, circulating without original author, generating meaning through repetition and difference. There Deleuze's difference and repetition as internet culture. Identity as construction. Online, identity is explicitly constructed. Avatars, usernames, profiles. We perform identities across platforms. Catfishing, anonymity, multiplicity of accounts, all embody postmodern insights about identity as unstable and constructed. Deepfakes and post-truth. AI-generated images and videos indistinguishable from reality realize Baudrillard's nightmare. Copies without originals, simulations producing what we take as real. Fake news, alternative facts, and epistemic chaos reflect postmodern conditions. Rhizomatic networks. The Internet structure is rhizomatic, decentralized, non-hierarchical, connecting any nodes. Wikipedia, open-source software, blockchain, these embody alternatives to tree-like hierarchical organization. Digital culture doesn't prove postmodern theory correct, but it intensifies conditions postmodernism diagnosed, making its questions more urgent. How do we navigate proliferating realities? How do we distinguish truth from fiction when production of convincing fakes is democratized? How do we maintain identity in fluid, multiple, performative contexts? How do we build solidarity across fragmented communities? Politics. Postmodernism's complicated legacy. Postmodernism's political legacy is deeply ambivalent. Progressive movements. Postmodern theory contributed to feminism, queer theory, critical race theory, disability studies, and post-colonial studies, revealing how categories are constructed, how power operates through knowledge and norms, how marginalized perspectives challenge dominant frameworks. Activism around gender fluidity, non-binary identities, and trans rights draws on postmodern destabilization of fixed categories. Right-wing appropriation. Ironically, right-wing populism adopted postmodern tactics. Trump's alternative facts, authoritarians' attacks on media as fake news, conspiracy theories undermining expert consensus, these weaponize postmodern skepticism about truth and authority. Jordan Peterson and others blame postmodernism for identity politics and political correctness. But right-wing movements deploy their own version, nationalism, traditionalism, and anti-liberalism as identity politics, just for different identities. This creates confusion. Is postmodernism progressive or reactionary? The answer is neither inherently. Postmodern tools, deconstructing grand narratives, revealing power in knowledge claims, emphasizing identity and difference, can serve various politics. The same skepticism about media that enables progressive critique of corporate propaganda enables right-wing claims about fake news.
This suggests postmodernism's political meaning isn't intrinsic but depends on how it's deployed. Its critical tools can be used for emancipation or domination, liberation or mystification. Climate crisis, postmodernism's blind spot and opportunity. Climate change reveals both postmodernism's failures and its potential contributions. The failure. Climate crisis demands recognizing material, physical, biological realities not reducible to discourse. Carbon in atmosphere, rising temperatures, species extinction, these aren't social constructions. Postmodernism's emphasis on cultural analysis and skepticism about science was ill-equipped for this reality. Climate denialism weaponized postmodern skepticism, treating climate science as just one narrative among many, questioning objectivity, emphasizing uncertainty. While postmodern theorists generally supported climate science, their theoretical frameworks provided rhetorical ammunition for deniers. The opportunity. Yet, postmodern tools help analyze climate politics. Foucault's power/knowledge helps reveal how fossil fuel interests shaped scientific debate. Discourse analysis exposes how framing determines what's thinkable: climate change versus climate crisis versus climate emergency. Situated knowledges centers perspectives of indigenous peoples and frontline communities. Moreover, climate crisis challenges modern assumptions, progress, human mastery over nature, technological solutions that postmodernism critiqued. It vindicates postmodern skepticism about grand narratives of progress and control. Recent work, Timothy Morton's Hyperobjects, Bruno Latour's Turn to Climate Politics, Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble, attempts to bring postmodern insights to ecological crisis without lapsing into denial or social constructionism. Contemporary theory, metabolizing postmodernism. Today's most interesting theory doesn't reject postmodernism wholesale, but metabolizes it, incorporating its insights while addressing its failures. Critical realism, Roy Bhaskar, Margaret Archer, argues that reality exists independently of our knowledge while acknowledging our access is mediated and fallible. Combines realism about ontology with postmodern sophistication about epistemology. Pragmatist retrievals, Cornel West, Richard Bernstein. Return to American pragmatism, Dewey, James, as alternative to both modernist foundationalism and postmodern anti-foundationalism. Emphasizes practical consequences, democratic experimentationalism, and fallibilist but robust commitment to truth and justice. Post-secular theory. Explores religion's return after secularization's supposed triumph. Draws on postmodern critique of Enlightenment secularism while taking religious traditions seriously as intellectual resources, not just objects of study. Affect theory. Studies emotions, feelings, and non-cognitive dimensions postmodern rationalism sometimes neglected. Influenced by Deleuze, but moves beyond him, exploring embodiment, sensation, and affective politics. Social ontology and critical theory. Philosophers like Axel Honneth, Nancy Fraser, and Rahel Jaggi develop social theory that retains critical ambitions while incorporating postmodern insights about power, identity, and constructedness. These approaches don't abandon postmodern insights. They retain skepticism about foundations, attention to power and language, recognition of situatedness. But they attempt what postmodernism struggled with, providing positive grounds for critique, engaging with material realities, enabling solidarity and coalition. Why it still matters, the unfinished questions. Postmodernism still matters because the questions it raised remain unresolved. Can we live without foundations? Postmodernism showed foundational philosophies, whether based on God, reason, nature, or progress, rest on questionable assumptions. But it struggled to articulate what replaces foundations. We still grapple with this. How do we make ethical and political commitments recognizing their contingency and contestability? How do we navigate multiple realities? In pluralistic, globalized, digitized societies, we encounter incommensurable frameworks, conflicting truths, proliferating realities. Postmodernism diagnosed this, but didn't fully resolve how we build shared worlds across difference. What's the relationship between power and knowledge? Foucault revealed power's constitutive role in knowledge. But we still struggle with implications. Can we criticize power structures using knowledge produced within them? How do we distinguish useful critique from relativist dismissal? How do we balance universal and particular? Postmodernism critiqued false universals but struggled to articulate legitimate universals. Contemporary politics, human rights, global justice, climate action require some universal claims. How do we make them without repeating colonial or patriarchal impositions?
How do we resist absorption? Postmodern critique, transgression, and subversion were repeatedly commodified and neutralized. How do we develop critique that resists absorption? Is resistance even possible within systems, or must we seek alternatives outside? What is identity? Postmodernism destabilized identity as fixed essence, revealing it as constructed, performed, and multiple. But people still organize around identities, experience them as real, and make claims based on them. How do we theorize identity's simultaneous constructedness and importance? These aren't just academic puzzles. They're lived dilemmas for anyone navigating contemporary life. Postmodernism didn't answer them definitively, but it identified them with clarity and urgency. The afterlife, a haunting. Postmodernism's afterlife is a haunting. Its concepts circulate, often unattributed. Its questions persist, often unacknowledged. Its failures and successes shape contemporary thought, even in movements that define themselves against it. We're neither simply postmodern nor post-postmodern. We're in a messy transitional moment. Some conditions postmodernism diagnosed intensify: digital simulation, fragmentation, identity politics. Others emerge that it didn't anticipate: climate crisis, AI, new authoritarianism. We need postmodern tools: genealogy, deconstruction, discourse analysis, attention to power and difference. But we also need what postmodernism lacked: robust political economy, engagement with materiality, grounds for solidarity and commitment. The afterlife of postmodernism isn't resurrection or final death, but productive haunting. Its ghost unsettling comfortable certainties, raising uncomfortable questions, demanding we think without foundations while still building, critique without guarantees while still acting, recognize contingency while still committing. Perhaps that's postmodernism's lasting contribution. Not a doctrine or method, but an attitude. Critical, self-reflexive, suspicious of grand narratives and universal claims, attentive to power and difference, comfortable with ambiguity and instability, yet still engaged, still hopeful in a non-utopian way, still committed to justice without capital J justice. It's uncomfortable, paradoxical, difficult to maintain, but so is the world we inhabit. Postmodernism prepared us, imperfectly, incompletely, for living in that world. Its afterlife continues that preparation, adapting its insights to new conditions, correcting its failures, pursuing its unfinished questions. The game postmodernism started, pulling meaning apart to see what's underneath, isn't over. We're still playing.